guys can hear the music? Can you hear the music?
Yes.
You guys can do witty banter while I'm doing my work.
PineCreek feature.
That happened during your last stream, Doug. The bit of Pete going PineCreek.
I know.
Are you going to incorporate it into the intro?
I should. Carl Sagan. My mom and dad. Just want them to be proud of me. If I had the proper amount of love, I might still be a Christian today.
Oh!
Did I just say that? Oh, sorry, Mom.
I've always thought that you being unloved, Doug, was the explanation of a lot of your psychology. That's why you're such a maverick.
Yeah.
Can't derive meaning and purpose out of other people loving you if nobody does.
Yeah, it probably also explains a lot of your political views as well.
Hey, I can shut this live stream down now. Did you spit on yourself?
I was really close to just spitting out my coffee.
Welcome, welcome. Let's see who gets 1,000 Pine points for being first. Lucifer Almighty, you're rich. I'm telling you, I think you're up to 9 or 10,000 Pine points now. 1,000 Pine points added to that. I have a feeling you and I will be staying at the luxurious suite in Tropicana in Las Vegas, Nevada someday. Once you reach 1,000,000 Pine points. Okay, congratulations to Tiger Woods, won a Masters. I think it's the first time since 2005. So I'm sure maybe only 1 or 2 people care about that. I was watching that today. But okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to try to. I took the first Kamil. Oh, this is Kamil, by the way. No, Dr. Kamil Gregor, PhD from Prague, Czechoslovakia. Yeah. And Cam, he's just the guy.
No, you know, as what's the name of the guy from Star Trek? Damn it, Jim. I'm a doctor, not a Bible scholar.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. I don't want to look like Kent Hovind, you know. So I don't have a PhD in anything that's even remotely relevant to this. So.
Well,
but a month from now, I'm going to be doing my entrance exam for an undergraduate program in ancient history, which means I should have a PhD in this in like 10 years. So working on it.
And you think that will help Christians listen to you? If you think that, you're
well,
deceived.
if anything, that's probably going to like turn them away even faster than they already do now. But maybe I'm gonna be the first person who started as a non-Christian, then became an ancient historian, and then converted to Christianity because of the amazing historical evidence for the resurrection. Who knows?
That's true. So what are you saying? You're saying that there's no person who was first an atheist, then got trained in historical criticism, and then converted to Christianity on the basis of the evidence?
Well, everyone that I've found so far, they've either always been a Christian or they converted for some other reason that doesn't necessarily apply to Christianity exclusively, or they converted before getting the training.
That's a bit surprising, isn't it?
Yeah, it's weird. That's not what you would expect at all if the evidence is really amazing. You would expect that the experts who are trained in this would be the first to realize how amazing the evidence is.
And Cam is my best friend from New Zealand,
Who lives in California?
who is in California. Okay, so what I did is we're gonna listen to the first, I think 7 or 8 minutes of what's his name, Mike Winger's. Mike Winger's introduction, and then I think 8 or 9 minutes of Matt's, and then we're gonna listen to 10 minutes of the back and forth, and then we're gonna skip some, and then go another 10 minutes. I'm going to. There's no way we're gonna play all of it because it's 2 hours, and we'd be here for 4 hours. So our goal is to try to get this like around an hour and a half, which is going to be probably closer to 2 hours, but we'll see. So buckle up, fasten your seatbelts. I think I have it queued up here at the right spot.
I have my coffee ready.
Oh, don't say that. I can't drink coffee anymore. Well, I decaffeinated it.
I know.
But decaffeinated coffee is just like brown water. So what's the use? Okay, here we go.
There we go. You should have it on your screens now. Here's the 12 facts.
Oh, the rules are just raise your hand and then I'll stop it.
I know you can't read that, most of you, but I want you to have it as a screenshot. You could slow down and read them. I will summarize them in a much smaller fashion now, like this. Okay, so the first fact is that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Bart Ehrman, the atheist, he says this is one of the most certain facts of history, that Jesus was crucified on the...
Bart Ehrman says this is one of the most certain facts of history. Tiger Woods just won the Masters about an hour ago, half an hour ago. Is that more or less certain than that Jesus rose from the dead? What would Bart Ehrman say about that?
Or Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. I guess what Mike is, to be charitable, I think he's saying one of the best established facts of ancient history.
Yeah. I think Mike just forgot an adjective.
Yeah,
Orders of
first
Roman
century history.
prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. He offers 11 independent sources to support the death of Christ in this fashion. I could quote atheist after atheist that actually support this idea, who are historians and scholars in their fields. The second fact, if I can get my thing to scroll down, there we go. The second fact is that soon after the crucifixion, the disciples lost hope. They were discouraged, they were bereaved, they were despondent. They thought that everything was over. And there's no wonder, because they saw the death of Christ as proof that the Jewish leaders were right about Jesus, that this guy was obviously from the enemy and not from God. And the impact this would have would be the end of the movement, as it ended every messianic movement in the first century when the guy died.
And I think the fact that they lost hope is only found within the Bible.
The third fact is that he was buried most likely in a private tomb. This is connected to the fourth fact, which is that Jesus' tomb was found empty soon after his interment. Now, of all the facts I'm going to share with you guys, these two, the entombment and the empty tomb, are the least supported by scholars. So I'm putting that out there, right? About 75% of scholars will agree with both of these. So there's still majority support, and it's across various worldviews. It's not just Christian or evangelical scholars.
Okay, this whole business. First of all, I want to commend Mike for saying that, for actually ranking. So he's going to put 12 up here, but his screen share didn't work properly. But out of the 12, he says that the entombed body of Jesus or the empty tomb are the least. These are probably the most important, but they're the least verified by scholarship, right? And to this day, this 75% number bothers me, because I don't think anybody knows what percentage of scholars, who these scholars are, what they exactly believe about these various minimal facts.
Yeah, I'm wondering if I had to guess, that number probably comes from Gary Habermas, because he very famously has apparently a very long list of scholars, and then would they think about various issues. And he has cited these percentages in his various works. But the problem is he has never actually published the data, so we don't know who these scholars are. And from other sources, for example, from Mike Lacona, who studied under him, we know that they are overwhelmingly not historians. And they are not even exclusively New Testament experts. It, for example, includes theologians, right? So I would say it's the historicity of the empty tomb is probably in a majority position. Would you say that, Cam? Probably yes, right?
Yeah, and then there's that additional factor that I think scholarship in this area does suffer from a little bit of selection bias, where those folks publishing on it, which is the criteria for being included in the list of Gary Habermas, they are people who are invested in the question of the resurrection or the empty tomb. And given the population of scholars in the field, that does mean that a lot of them are Christians. So,
but I'm going to build a case for it. So let me give you 6 lines of evidence that support the empty tomb. The first one is this. It's multiply attested. We have it in multiple sources, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, as well as pre-Markan accounts.
Multiple sources, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Some could argue that that's one source because of the synoptic problem, the huge amount of borrowing going on. And even if you're a Christian listening and say, no, these are 4 independent accounts, you would have to, I think, at least admit they're not entirely independent. There's word for word copying of verses and so forth. You know this. You know that what I'm saying is true.
Well, it's a little bit worse than that, because in synoptic studies, we do have a consensus of scholars that Mark and Luke are actually redacting, Matthew and Luke are redacting Mark in their elaborations on the empty tomb story. So, like, this precise piece of the claim about the empty tomb is actually being borrowed from Mark. It's not just like broadly that Mark is being used as a source. He's being used as a source specifically in this section.
Yeah, and also the historicity of the empty tomb is a really nice illustration of the threshold problem, right? So at best, like if you're super charitable, you have 4 somewhat independent sources. One is the pre-Pauline hymns and creeds that are preserved by Paul, maybe. Then you have Paul, then you have the synoptics, and then you have John, which I would be happy to grant for the sake of argument that John is independent from the synoptics, right? The problem is that the empty tomb is only mentioned in the 2 of the 4 sources, and it's mentioned in the 2 of the latest sources. So if you employ the criterion of multiple independent attestation and criterion of how close the account is to the actual event, should you be confident that this is something that really happened or not? So it's 2 out of 4. Like, or should you be agnostic? That's a good question. And also one thing I wanted to say about the crucifixion by the Roman crucifixion. The question is, did that happen on Earth or in the lower heavens by space Romans? But it's just a joke.
Source material for Mark, sermons and Acts, we have it in that content as well. We have it suggested in the writings of Paul. So we have multiple sources attesting to this, early sources as well. Number 2 is enemy.
I can't let Mike get away with that. So he says that we have the empty tomb suggested in our earliest writings, Paul. But one thing that we definitely don't have in Paul is any explicit statement about Jesus being entombed in any fashion that's similar to the gospel narrative. We find a complete absence of such a claim by Paul, and that is our earliest evidence. To me, I find that unexpected. So, for example, if we imagine that Paul believed the same things about Jesus' entombment as what the gospel authors did, I think it's unexpected he doesn't reference that in 1 Corinthians 15.
Although, to play the devil's advocate, Cam, if you could travel back in time and have a conversation with Paul, and you would ask him, imagine you went to the tomb of Jesus right now, would you expect it to find empty? What do you think Paul would say?
I'm actually unsure. Because like as I've stated a number of times, I tend to think of Paul's belief as of Christ's resurrection actually being revealed in a heavenly manner via revelation. Like, I don't think that Paul thinks it traces to events that were witnessed on earth. I think he thinks it was revealed from...
Sure. That's not a question about the source of information. It's just a question about Paul's worldview, right? Like, I think he probably didn't think that much about what happened with the body. But if that question was brought to his attention, do you think he would pause and say, yeah, you know what, his tomb is probably empty, like the body that he died in is no longer in the tomb? What do you think? Like, do you think he would say that?
Yeah, maybe. I'm still unsure about that, because, like, in 1 Corinthians 15, he makes a lengthy argument that we will be given new bodies, bodies that are stored up in heaven by God in our resurrection. And that's like, for example, when you die and the ravages of time destroy your body, that doesn't put you in a position where God can't resurrect you, because he can provide you a new body. And so I don't know whether or not Paul thinks that Jesus's body was transformed, his existing on earth physical body was transformed, or whether or not it was exchanged. And there is an argument that's made by I'm trying to think who it is. Or anyway, I might come back to it, but there is an argument made that the language being used in 1 Corinthians 15 is one of exchange of bodies, not one of transformation.
Yeah, and
but I'm unsure.
Yeah,
I don't know.
We got to move on, but it's pretty clear that when Paul thinks of a resurrected body, it's different. He compares it to the seed, and the seed has to go away before it can. Or no, it changes into the wheat plant or whatever.
Attested. We can get into more in this in the back and forth. I just want to get this on the table for discussion. It's enemy attested. In Matthew 28, we have the enemies of the Christians, of the early Christians. What they say about the death of Jesus is that his tomb is empty because it was robbed by the Christians. They stole the body. This continued on into the 2nd century. In Justin Martyr, we hear it. In Tertullian, we hear it. And in Celsus, the critic of Christians, he mocks Christians and says they stole the body. So
he mocks.
When the enemy polemic accepts the empty tomb, I think we can say that it's very likely that it happened, which leads us to the third piece of evidence supporting it. There's no competing story.
You look like you want to say something, Kamil.
So when Donald Trump says that CNN is fake news, does that mean that we have an account of CNN saying they are fake news?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think to contextualize this thing a little bit more, in the Greco-Roman world in the 1st century and before, there was this particular mytheme of a alternate, like, odious story that explains the origin of a particular cult's belief. So, for example, for Zalmoxis, there was this Greek, I consider it like a polemic against the Thracians, that Zalmoxis really just like hid underground and emerged 3 years later in order to prove that he provided immortality to the Thracian believers. So like an origin of an odious story is something that is common amongst these broad translation stories of a figure being like exalted to heaven and, you know, providing some type of salvation.
Yeah, but don't you know that God had erected a wall of separation between paganism and Judaism and declared that never shall the two meet?
Okay, guys, we really have to go.
There's no story from the 1st century even suggesting something other than this happened, and we have multiple sources, including enemy attestation, that it did. Number 4, we have the testimony of women. This is more impressive to those who study history more, because it was embarrassing back then. The first people to proclaim the empty tomb were women, yet women were not good witnesses to Jewish or Roman people at the time. So it reads like real history. The women are part of the story because they couldn't get them out of the story. So embarrassing or not, they had to include them in the story of the empty tomb.
It's not embarrassing at all for women to put spices on dead people. It's not embarrassing at all for slaves to put spices on dead people. Back then, that's what women and slaves did. And so therefore, it's not embarrassing at all. That would make sense if this was a story and totally made up. It would make sense within the context of the story.
You go.
I was just going to say that the minimal facts argument has been used for decades and decades. You go back to the earliest YouTube videos. It's almost getting completely and utterly boring because a lot of these, even if you're a Christian, you disagree with the rebuttals. You have to admit we've gone through this over and over and over and over and over again. Like, Come up with something new already, because if you don't know the answers that Cam, me, and Kamil would give before we even give it, you haven't even begun to study what you believe. Okay, go ahead, Cam.
Yeah, I agree with that. One thing I wanted to say is this is an instance of yellow brick road apologetics. So the story of the woman testifying to Jesus's resurrection, it's part of the story. It's like the yellow brick road in the Wizard of Oz, and you have to first make an argument that that actually occurred, as opposed to just observe that it's written in the text. And he does kind of try to do that by saying it would be embarrassing, but I don't think that that's sufficient to establishing it. Really, the object to be explained is, why would an author write this? And there are many explanations that equally account for why we would find this in the text that don't include them actually witnessing Jesus resurrected. It just sort of, I think he's too ready to just trust the Gospels. But anyway.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Evangelical Christians in the United States, they come to the text of the Bible in a special way. These are special texts to them. Even before they've read it, there's probably some verses that maybe they've read before I haven't quite comprehended, but everything for many, many, many Christians within the Bible is precious. And so they give it an automatic respect, an automatic pass, an automatic, we believe this on face value, even before reading half of it. And so you see this with all religions and their holy texts, that they got to defend it to the hilt.
Richard Bauckham's done really great work in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, on this as well, that helps support the...
Sorry, Richard Bockham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I'm not saying that because I'm an atheist or anything. It's literally the worst academic text that I've ever read. And probably one of my first papers that I'm going to write is going to be a rebuttal to 10 different things that he got completely wrong in that book. And if I ever meet him in person, I'm going to ask him to give payback, even though I pirated the book probably.
Bauckham is the guy who said, basically, if an author like Luke mentions certain characters or certain people within the text, that is him citing a source. Isn't that where I heard Inspiring Philosophy say that? I've heard Mike Winger say that. Just by mentioning characters within a story, is the author citing a source? No, it's not.
Yeah, he has this thing, which I think he made up. He's arguing that there was a literary device in ancient literature called inclusio, where an author doesn't have to say, this is my source. He just mentions the name of a person at the beginning and at the end of the information that the source is supplying. And that kind of points to it being an eyewitness source. But the problem is that Bauckham doesn't really define very rigorously how that's supposed to look like, which means in turn he doesn't really have a methodology for identifying in the text. So it ends up literally being, you can take any text, fictional or factual, and just find the first and last instance of a name of a character appearing in the text. And by his theory, everything in between is an eyewitness account provided by that person. You can do it with Lord of the Rings, with Harry Potter, anything, right? And the best thing about it is that Bauckham actually cites examples where this device was supposedly used in ancient literature, like, for example, porphyry. But if you go into those sources, into those other examples of ancient literature and actually look them up, you'll find that porphyry, for example, says, this person is my source. I interviewed him. He is an eyewitness. So the examples that Bauckham gives completely, they are not the examples of what he's trying to show, right? They are examples of people mentioning, describing what their sources were. Yeah, there are 10 things on this level of wrong in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It's really, yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah, I agree with all that assessment. Another aspect is that if you are trying to use this observation that there is like a mention of one person and a mention of that same person in some part of the narrative, you need to consider that there are other explanations for those two mentions. And so you can't simply assume that the only explanation is that they're being cited as a source, because how do you then distinguish that from the fact that just for other reasons, the person gets mentioned more than once? This happens all the time in literature, as you point out, with Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, et cetera, et cetera. So you need some type of method of distinguishing those two things. And it's not the case that the prior probability is that these methods of citing sources were so common that you would expect it to be the case, as opposed to just natural mentions of a character more than once.
Can I ask a favor, you guys? You stop mocking the holy text and comparing it to Harry Potter?
Yeah, this is a targeted attack.
The eyewitness account of the women. Number 5, Joseph of Arimathea seems historical. Joseph of Arimathea is the guy who buried Jesus. He put him in the tomb. He's a member of the Sanhedrin, so he would be known to the people of the time. He's multiply attested in Mark, John, and Luke. He's local to the area. Arimathea was likely 4 to 5 miles northwest of Jerusalem, and so it would have been testable by the people in the area. And it was embarrassing that a Sanhedrin member actually helps Jesus when the disciples have fled. So when people admit embarrassing things, these things are more likely to be true when you're reading a historical account, or anybody's account for that matter.
When you're reading a historical account, see, there's an assumption, a presupposition, I would say, that you're reading history to begin with. Maybe you're not. This is the problem with people who are already within the belief. They presuppose that what they're reading is history. Maybe some of it's history, maybe some of it's fiction. How would you tell the difference? What criteria are you using? If this is fiction, then an embarrassing account would help keep the story interesting and move it along, and sort of like most screenplays where you have a struggle and a problem and some character looks bad and then at the end he looks really good. Did you want to say something, Kamil?
Yeah, but more importantly, Isaiah, I think it's 42, something like that, says that the suffering servant is going to die with the wicked and be buried with the rich.
I think it's 52.
Is it 52? Oh, okay, yeah.
No, 53.
I thought
53.
I thought it was earlier.
Oh,
but
no,
anyway,
you're right. You are. No, I think you are right.
Yeah. Well, for me, and I'm sure that's like I'm channeling my inner hatred for God. Like everything in the Gospels that looks like, even if there isn't the fulfillment formula, so the evangelist actually saying, and so as the prophet Isaiah said, if you have something in the narrative that looks like it's a fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy, that's immediately suspect. Just the prior probability of the author using the Old Testament as a source of historical information about what happened to Jesus is like vastly more probable that this happened in history, either coincidentally or because there was actually a prophecy that was fulfilled, right? But just a quick question, Cam, do you know if Arimathea, like the town, is it mentioned anywhere outside the Gospels? I don't think so, right?
Yeah, I was wanting to get into that. I don't know a lot of the detail, but Mike asserts in a way that suggests that there isn't controversy about the identification of Arimathea. There is a quite a reasonable group of scholars who have argued that really the name Arimathea is like a symbolic name, meaning something like good disciple or best disciple or something like that, or best disciple town, something like that. So I think the straightforward identification with an actual place is not sound, or at least it's not like agreed upon by scholars.
This is Isaiah 53, verse 9. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence. This is what I keep telling Mike over and over again when he talks about Jesus is found within the Old Testament. And I say, yes, he is. But what is more likely? What is more probable? If an author is using the Old Testament as source material, he's reading Isaiah 53, verse 9, saying, he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. Maybe if I have this character named Joseph of Arimathea from the Sanhedrin, those group of people who wanted him dead, this rich guy come along to actually bury him. Yeah, that fits the prophecy. So this is just how.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and one important thing is, like, if you think this was going on, it doesn't necessarily mean that the author was being deceptive, right? Yeah, like I don't think that the evangelists, if they did that, were just like thinking about just like inventing lies or being manipulative or something like that. They believed already before they wrote the Gospels that Jesus really was the Messiah, was the Son of God, did rise from the dead, did ascend to heaven. And more importantly, they believed that there are prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament. So it would make sense for them to use the Old Testament as a source of historical information about what actually happened to Jesus. So for example, when I think it's Hosea says that the Son of God, God will send his son out of Egypt or something
Out of
like
Egypt,
that.
I will call my son.
I will call my son. Yeah. So when the Matthean evangelist read that, and he became convinced that this is a prophecy speaking about Jesus, because obviously Jesus was the Son of God. So who else that might be? He treated it as a source of historical information. So he thought that must mean that at some point during his life, Jesus was in Egypt, and then he went out of Egypt, and that's how the prophecy was fulfilled, right? And then the second Matthew chapter 2, I think, is just his plausible rendition of that historical fact that he already accepted as actually taking place, right? I don't think there you have to posit any deception or like making up a story to lie to
That's
people.
a great point, Kamil, because I get accused when I say stuff like this from a lot of Christians that, oh, Doug is a conspiracy theorist. And, but what you're pointing out is that the author could have sincerely believed that this is the result of prophecy, and that this is just God working through the Old Testament, flowing through into their current day. Cam, you were going to say something?
Yeah, so I agree with that view, but I also think that there's a wider story to tell, because I don't think that all of the instances of Jesus being like a rewritten figure from the Old Testament have this pious prophecy style belief attached to them by the evangelist. So I think that the author of the Gospel of Mark is doing this with scripture, not because he thinks scripture is prophecy like Matthew does, but instead because he's using a common form of literary composition of using prior sources to cast an important figure to tell an important moral message in a new narrative and a new story. Like, I don't think that we should limit ourselves only to those explanations that include the author doing it because they believe it's actually prophecy. Because
finally, the
the
sixth
reason for this is because, like, there are many Old Testament texts that I think are used that are not prophetic in any manner. For example, we'll get into later, Psalm 22. It doesn't seem to me that any educated Jew or Hellenized Jew would mistake Psalm 22 as being prophetic.
And Jews don't think that today, so...
Okay, we got to move on, guys.
I did want to just make a couple of quick notes on Joseph of Arimathea, though. I do find it interesting that in the same way as with Simon of Cyrene, we see him carrying Jesus's cross instead of Simon Peter. It is interesting that instead of Joseph of Nazareth, the father of Jesus, being the one who goes and requests the body of Jesus as like a normal father would do, as you, for example, see in stories of Priam in the Odyssey? Oh, sorry, in the Trojan. The Iliad. I think it is interesting that we find another character, Joseph. Instead of Joseph of Nazareth, we find Joseph of Arimathea going and requesting the body from Pilate. So there is more here that can be said about these conveniently named characters. Joseph of Arimathea, Joseph of Best Disciple Town, instead of Joseph of Nazareth doing the father's role of requesting the body of their son.
Yeah, it's
Jesus Bar Abbas, right?
Yeah, Jesus Barabbas is
hey,
another instance.
we got to keep moving. We got to keep moving. But yeah, that's a great point, Cam. Who are the two people that were around when Jesus was born? The two main people, Joseph and Mary. When he died, Joseph and Mary. But this time, Joseph of Arimathea and Mary Magdalene. Here we go.
We found 3 kinds of tombs from the time of Christ that have been discovered, and Jesus's tomb fits one of those kinds. In particular, it's the most expensive kind, which was known to be owned by, get this, people like members of the Sanhedrin. Think about this. We have archaeological verification that the empty tomb story is historical in nature. Jody Magnus, who actually works at the same college as Bart Ehrman, she's an expert on Jewish burial practices. She says the gospel accounts describing Jesus' removal from the cross and burial accord well with archaeological evidence and with Jewish law. So the conclusion is that it's supported by 6 different arguments, and I actually don't know of a good argument to refute the empty tomb. And people I talk to don't know.
I don't know a good argument to refute the empty tomb.
I bet you don't.
Mike, if that's true, you haven't even begun to study what you believe. And I say that sincerely and seriously. If you can't even think of another argument, you haven't even begun to think. Is that too harsh?
Well, it is frustrating that time and time again, Mike presents these same things. Well, I mean, I guess it's happened like 3 times now, and he has been responded to on it, yet he never presents what the responses are and actually engages with them. It just sort of goes back to the same like Christian assertions that we've seen in videos over and over again on the internet.
Yeah, and just to address what he was saying, that's amazing evidence that whoever wrote the Gospels, whoever the authors were, they had seen a burial, which I've seen a burial, right? So I would be able to describe fairly accurately what's going on, right? It would be actually it would be actually much more interesting, but unexpected if Jesus's body was like put on a catapult and like shot flying through the air. Like what would you expect in a fictional story? Of course, it's gonna describe how a tomb looks like, right? Because it's a part of the story.
This reminds me, I'm going to get in so much trouble for saying this, but this reminds me of how Mormons defend the Book of Mormon at times. You know, they come up with some experts saying, oh, this would fit nicely within, you know, what we're reading within the text. It's just, yeah, this shows this is evidence that's actually is historical and happened.
One either. Even scholars I've asked. They don't.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to just a broken aspect of Mike's epistemology, and I want to get this really accurate. When we are considering data as being evidence for one claim or another, what we're really saying is that the data is more expected on this one claim versus another. But the problem with Mike is that he short circuits the process. He doesn't include or consider what the other hypothesis would expect. In this particular case, he seems to think that it's sufficient to just observe that the tomb is consistent with what tombs were. But tombs would be consistent with what tombs were if the author just knew something about tombs. Like, so it's like it can't be evidence for the thing that he's claiming it's evidence for, because it's not more expected on that assumption than on the other assumption. And he does this consistently in his epistemology. He just fails to consider alternate hypotheses in detail and what they would actually expect.
Yeah, I know we need to move on, but there's one like extremely important thing that I've just remembered. Later on during the back and forth, Mike asks Matt this question: if the description of the empty tomb, if the empty tomb narrative and the description of the burial was historically inaccurate, if it was contradicting what we know about the burial practices in that time and that area, would you count that as evidence against the story being true? And Matt, as most people, says yes, right? And then Mike says, aha, So if you think that, then you have to think, conversely, that the story being consistent should count as evidence towards his historical reliability, right? But the problem is that this symmetry doesn't actually exist, right? So it's entirely possible to disprove a narrative by showing like anachronisms, historical inconsistencies, and stuff like that. But the absence of anachronisms and historical inconsistencies does not necessarily count as evidence in favor.
Yeah,
Richard. Yeah.
I was just going to say that
Go ahead.
that reminds me of the game where I have a rule, 3 numbers, 2, 4, 6. Say 3 numbers that fit the rule, and someone says 8, 10, 12. Yes, that fits the rule. But the key here is the rule is just any increment of numbers, not just even numbers or going up by 2s. And so the goal here is if you value truth, the goal is to try to falsify your claim. And then then you're getting close to figuring out what is the truth in a matter.
Yeah, there is actually an interesting example of this. So Richard Bauckham, which we have discussed already, he makes the same. He has the same flaw in his book, where he goes through this like amazing work of cataloging the names, all known names of Jews from around that area, and he finds out that the distribution of names in the New Testament is roughly equivalent to the distribution of names, of all known names of Jews from that time and that area, right? And he uses that as evidence for like a support for the accounts being historical, right? Which is not, it's not actually evidence for the same reason as an accurate description of the burial procedures or practices is not evidence. It's just what you would expect even if the story was fiction. However, there have been historical research into names and linguistics that have refuted some sacred texts, specifically the Book of Mormon, because linguists have shown that the names found in the historical descriptions in the Book of Mormon are not what you would expect to find if you were actually describing descendants of people who built a wooden submarine and sailed from Judea or Syro-Palestine to Northern America, right? So it's actually possible to analyze the names in a sacred text and find out that it's probably incorrect. But if you find that it's consistent, it doesn't count as evidence towards it being historically accurate. The symmetry is not there. That's the point.
Okay, I want to play 3 more minutes of Mike, and then we'll get into Matt, and we'll try to lambaste him equally.
I don't know of a single good argument or evidence-based argument, just ad hoc stuff, but nothing based on evidence like these are. G.H. Van Dalen concludes, it's extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. You could look at the work of Bart Ehrman, for example, in that. So number 5, let's go to the next one, which is the appearances. The 5th fact I'll say is well evidenced from history is that the disciples had individual and group experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Christ. We have accounts of 2 people seeing Jesus, 7 people, 11, multiple times where the disciples as a group did, 500 at once, according to Paul. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul, he knows these people, and personally he'd visited them, and he's relaying as what was known and said by them all along, that he appeared to Peter, and he appeared to James, and he appeared to the 12. So this is multiple attestation in different sources. In fact, these sources are in and outside the New Testament. We have other early accounts like Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Justin Martyr, that also say, yeah, there were these group appearances, whatever you want to say they were. If you want to call it, they were somehow delusional, but it happened in a group. They all seemed to be seeing it, and it convinced them that Jesus rose. Gerhard Ludig.
There's just, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's just one instance of a group appearance, correct? Like 1 Corinthians 15 doesn't say that Jesus appeared to the disciples at one time, does it?
Yeah, in 1 Corinthians 15, it doesn't say. It says, and then he appeared to the 12 and then to all the apostles. It does say that he appeared to 500 brethren at the same time, I think.
Right.
So, yeah. But the problem, of course, is that 1 Corinthians doesn't give any details about the nature of the appearance or whether the individual appearances were like days apart, or it could be the way I always imagine it, and it's almost a joke. Like, imagine these 500 people, roughly 500 people, including, Peter and the disciples, something like that, walking somewhere in nature, and suddenly they see a Jesus-shaped cloud. And Peter is the one who notices the first. Then he tells the 12, so they look at it. Then James, I think, is the other one who notices. Then the 500 people, and then all the apostles are the last who saw that, right? I don't think that's what happened, but that scenario is equally consistent with what 1 Corinthians 15 says, as what Mike's is probably imagining, meaning harmonization with the Gospels.
Well, and so there are, to argue for the Christian point of view, Doug, there are group appearance traditions. For example, Jesus appears in the upper room, and I think in the Gospel of Luke, in the Emmaus narrative in the Gospel of Luke, he appears by the seaside in the Gospel of John with the the catch of fish. There's a whole bunch of group appearances. What do you say about those?
That was before or after his death?
After his death.
I would respond by saying that, what are their name? Whitmire, Caudry, Joseph Smith, and some other guy. They all saw all four of them saw, or five of them saw, and at one time saw the golden plates. Is that evidence that the golden plates existed in Mormonism? And if the Christian's going to say, yes, that what you just described in Luke is evidence that Jesus appeared to a group, then they have to admit that the golden plates were seen as evidence for the golden plates being presented to these four Mormons.
Yeah, one interesting point about the appearances is that Mike is absolutely correct that the idea that Jesus appeared to people, even multiple people at the same time, is independently attested. The problem is that none of the individual appearances and none of the details in these appearances are independently attested, right? Like, for example, the first appearance in Luke on the way to Emmaus, that's only in Luke. The appearance to 7 by the Sea of Galilee, by the Sea of Tiberias, that's only in John, right? So if I wanted to be really pedantic and consistently use the criteria of historical reliability, like multiple independent attestation, criterion of dissimilarity, and stuff like that, I would be happy to grant that Jesus appeared to multiple people, but I would not grant any of the individual appearances. For example, I would not grant that the disciples touched his wounds or that he ate a piece of fish, because those are the details that are only in one source. But those are the key details to establish that, for example, Jesus appeared bodily as opposed to in vision, right? Which obviously then means that it's much more easy to account for this on competing hypotheses, right? Like hallucinations or like grief-stricken visions or something like that. Grief-driven visions.
Okay, let me play another minute here.
Ludeman, who's an atheist and a lead critic of
he's mentioning Gerd Ludeman. I just watched that debate between him and Ludeman and Craig.
the resurrection. He says, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Mike Licona says this conclusion about the appearances is granted by a nearly unanimous consensus of modern scholars and may therefore be added to our historical bedrock. See, this is important because when we talk about possible explanations for these facts, we can rule out hallucinations because by nature of the fact that hallucinations don't happen in groups like this. And we can actually I can quote sources in our discussion back and forth.
Did you want to say something, Kamil?
Yeah, well, I mean, so what is he talking about, right? Like, historians agree that these people thought that, or these people experience something, but the historians don't think that what they experienced was the risen Christ, right? So that's an important distinction. And also, the historians don't think that, for example, the appearances of Jesus included him eating a piece of fish. They don't think that because it's just in one source, which is relatively late. It's in Luke, I think. But also, there are very good independent or competing reasons or alternative hypotheses for why an author would include that detail, even though that actually didn't happen. For example, because he wanted to establish that Jesus rose bodily in order to refute a docetic heresy.
See, I think the best way to explain this, or maybe somehow resonate with the Christian believer, is to put it in terms of a belief system they deem false, like Mormonism. That's why I keep bringing it up. And I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think there are Mormon historians out there who will say that Joseph Smith probably did have some type of experience of Moroni or Jesus. But do they for a second think that actually happened? Do Christians, do you actually believe that happened? He said it happened. Do you believe him? And if not, why not? And see, this gets into the whole cumulative case thing, and they start talking, piling all these types of evidence one on top of the other. One more minute, and then we'll move on to Matt.
Hallucinations just don't happen in groups in this fashion. So this would be difficult to overcome. Let's add another one. Due to the experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly transformed. These appearances, they transformed their lives, even being willing to die for the belief that they had seen the risen Christ and he'd physically risen from the dead. Again, this is actually not controversial. Persecution in the early church is attested to by multiple sources, Christian and non-Christian, and we have especially strong historical support for Peter, James, and Paul. Yeah, for some of the apostles, we're not sure how they may have died, but we have strong support they were generally persecuted, and specifically Peter, James, and Paul died of martyrdom. Why is this important? Because being eyewitnesses means they're in a position to know if they had really seen those things. Seeing it in group settings.
Mike.
Do you want to say anything about that, Kamil?
No, I actually, my original idea was to completely skip, don't talk about Mike at all, and really focus on Matt, because I want to criticize him for a couple of things that I strongly disagree with, right? And I actually wrote Mike on Facebook saying him, as an atheist, I think that there is a couple of errors that Matt wrote, that Matt made, and I want to point them out because I think that does damage to epistemology of history in the atheist community. And here we are, and we spent the first hour just piling on Mike. But I think it's justified because he's just copy-paste, right? He probably takes the same presentation and uses it every time and just doesn't register that there are the same points against his position over and over, right? Like if we had spent 15 minutes now talking about why we don't think that the people who would see the risen Jesus were persecuted and they didn't probably have the opportunity to recant, and if they did, it wouldn't change the outcome, and the sources are really shit. Do we really need to do that? Probably for the fifth time already.
Yeah. I just want to encourage Christians, though, if you don't know the answers to on the opposite side of what Mike just talked about, like martyrdom, I'll give a shout out to Apologia's channel. He did a really good a video recently on martyrdom. Do we have any evidence that they were given the opportunity to recant and so forth? So watch that. But again, if you don't know off the top of your head the rebuttals to your own claims that you or Mike are presenting, you haven't even begun to know why you believe what you believe. Okay, so let's get on to Matt and see what he has to say.
But and after that, we'll just go straight to dialogue. So take the floor, please.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me back, and thanks to Mike for doing this. I don't know, considering some of the things that were just said, I'm convinced Jesus resurrected. You guys win. Thanks for having me. Oh, wait, no, that's not the way this works. There were things said that I'll probably correct during the discussion part, but the subject is belief in the resurrection unreasonable, and I can say yes, whereas that does not mean that it's not true or didn't happen. This is just my case for why it's irreasonable. My mom has told me that she has seen demons with her own eyes. Now, I know my mom, and she's a generally honest person. Do I believe for one instant that she actually saw demons? No, because what she's presenting is the claim and not the evidence. Now, my mom's truthful enough that I'm willing to take her at her word that she experienced something and she's doing her best job to explain what it was using whatever language she has, but that doesn't mean that there's sufficient evidence yet to warrant demons or her seeing demons. So what is it that makes something convincing?
Okay. This is the problem. Like, I know exactly what Matt's doing here, but this is why I think it won't work. And that is a huge percentage of the Christians listening to Matt right now would believe Matt's mom. That's the problem. Now,
yeah, it's like the premise of the entire point of bringing it up isn't granted by the people who he's trying to make the point to.
like I would say, without exaggeration, 33%, a third of the Christians listening to Matt right now is going to say, "Oh, Matt's mom saw a demon? I did too." Like, this is the craziness we're dealing with here. Sorry, I apologize, but this, from my point of view, is just crazy. Go ahead, Kamil.
Yeah, but like, what would you use? If you use different gods, then that's just Satan in disguise. If you use alien abductions, those are either angels or demons as well.
I think the only way around this is to say something like, does every experience of a demon mean a demon was actually there? You got to say this to the Christian as softly and gently as you can. And intellectually honest Christians will say, no, of course not. Some people are just crazy. Some people are just mentally ill. Some people are just wrong. Okay, how do you tell the difference now between the real demons and the fake ones? And so it gets them thinking.
Yeah, another instance is that a lot of Christians reject the proposition that all claims of faith healing in Jesus's name actually occurred. They reject that. They think that there are many claims of faith healing in Jesus's name that didn't actually occur. And so you can get them from there to be like, okay, well, people end up believing that they occurred, and then understand how it is that like a bad epistemology can lead to these bad beliefs.
Or what is it that should make something reasonably convincing? Well, you have to evaluate the claim and then the evidence for the claim. And one of the things that Mike consistently did as he was talking was say, this is evidence, this is evidence, this is fact, this is evidence, this is evidence, when virtually everything that he was talking about at some level is the claim and not the evidence for it. Right up to the end where he says, oh, well, this is the evidence for the resurrection. No, these are the claims about a resurrection. The evidence for the resurrection is something else other than a whole bunch of people say it, they saw it happen, or had an experience afterward. He also noted that legend is the laziest and most irresponsible potential explanation for this collection of facts. And I would argue that magic did it is the laziest and most irresponsible explanation for these facts. Legend is perfectly reasonable, and there's nothing supernatural or required to appeal to the supernatural outside of that. I'm not going to be presenting anything mythicist other than noting that we have a problem, and it's a real problem for Christianity, in that not all mythicists are wrong and they're not all exaggerating. But this notion that, oh, here's all these points, I would like us to focus on these points and present counters. If we have a murder and somebody says, I'm convinced the butler did it, the butler doesn't have an alibi, and there's somebody over there who thinks they saw the butler, is that enough to convict? No, it's not. And at that point, I don't have to in any way demonstrate that the butler had an alibi or that the butler didn't do it. It's simply insufficient evidence to reach the conclusion that somebody's trying to push.
Go ahead, Kamil. I heard a big sigh from you when you was talking about claims are not evidence or something.
I don't know, Cam, do you want to start with this? This is probably my biggest complaint against Matt here.
No, you go for it.
Yeah, so basically, Matt is drawing a distinction between what he calls a claim and what he calls the evidence, right? And he's basically saying that if you have a text which includes some statement, like factual statement about something that happened in the real world, we should put it into the claims bucket and not into the evidence bucket.
Yeah, it's like he's saying that it can only serve as a claim.
Yeah, which means that if you take some event and you go through the texts and you find out, and everything else that you have around the world, like archaeological evidence and stuff like that, and you find out that the claims bucket is full of statements, but the evidence bucket is empty, then you are justified in concluding that the event probably, or you should suspend judgment or be agnostic about whether the event actually happened or not, right? And this is not a sound, I think, epistemology of history. Can you, Doug, can you put out the first picture that I showed you? So, because in preparation, I was trying to find some really like obscure statement from ancient literature, right? So this is a statement about a guy called Metrocles of Myronea, who was a minor cynic philosopher, right? And this is what Guy wrote about him 600 years later. So the amount of time between the supposed event taking place and the first, and as far as I know, the only time this was reported in ancient literature is 600 years, which is a long time. And we only have this. We doesn't have anything else. We don't have any archaeological evidence. We don't have any independent sources or anything like that. So, Doug, what is your level of confidence from 0 to 100 that this statement is true, based merely on the fact that the claim was made and nothing else?
0.
Really? Why?
Because it seems like a friction within the statement. Died of old age and choked himself are contradictory thoughts.
Well, you can. Well, you would have to probably go into the Greek. So that's not a good example. Then I should have picked something
Well, I
else.
think it's more expressing that he was old, and because a lot of people who are old, they actually choke because you can have things happen to you, like you have a stroke and then you
that's
recover,
true.
but it reduces your ability to swallow,
Yeah.
and people die. Like, it's actually quite common, but yeah.
That's true. I'll move it up to. You're saying what is the probability that this guy died? Let's say choking on a piece of chicken bone because he's old and he couldn't quite chew it well enough. People die because they're old all the time. So in that sense, yes, that's very probable.
Yeah. So the point is that if the prior probability of the claim being true is high enough, then you don't need the evidence bucket to be full of stuff, right? You don't need inscriptions, you don't need eyewitnesses, multiple contemporary sources, and stuff like that. The mere fact that the claim was made in the first place warrants the belief that it's probably true, even though the time distance is extremely large, 600 years, and even though the claim was made only once, or it survives in only one instance in all of ancient literature. I understand that what Matt is saying here is something a little bit different, because he's talking about claims that have very low prior probability, like people being raised from the dead. So I understand that. But the problem is that if you have this dichotomy between claims on one hand and evidence on the other hand, that can potentially lead to a bad epistemology of history amongst atheists, where people end up saying stuff like, unless a claim in ancient literature is supported by archaeological evidence, for example, I will refuse to believe that it happened, right? I will either reject it or remain agnostic, which I think is hyper-skepticism, right? It's being overly skeptical to a point where it's not warranted, right? So it could be the case that just the existence of the claim can be the sufficient evidence to warrant belief. You have to always look at what the prior probability is.
Yeah, although I would, so I think I agree with pretty much all of what you said there, except this particular instance, for me at least, on my epistemology, is going to be dependent on finding out a little bit more about where this claim was made and who it was made by. Because, for example, with my current knowledge, I don't know whether or not this was made in a text that was like a fictional text about this character. Like, for example,
Diogenes Laertius, Lives of Famous Philosophers.
Yeah, and so that makes it for me more plausible. It puts me in a position of being able to consider this. But for example, there are like euhemerization narratives about a variety of different people, and like if I found this in a euhemerization narrative, then I wouldn't consider this to be evidence. But like the two buckets that I want to create is I want to create the bucket of data and evidence for hypothesis or evidence against hypothesis. And this text being written for me would be in the data bucket, and in order for us to allow it to exist within the other buckets as well, we need to make an argument that we would expect this claim to be made more if it actually occurred than if it didn't and something else explains it. And that's very, very easy. It's a very easy argument to be made when you're considering the claim existing in like historical writings by a reliable historian. It's just not so easy to be made when it's written in a fictional text.
Okay, let me summarize this. So, Kamil, you're saying that if someone makes a claim that someone died of old age, for whatever reason, that's evidence for. But if someone claims, as you said here, that the sky blazed with fire, a man was burned alive by a beam that was generated from a spyglass, it rained milk, and a carrier pig was born with human hands and feet, that if someone makes that type of claim, eyewitness claim, then that shouldn't be viewed as evidence.
Yeah, this second example that this illustrates the concept of prior probability, right? So these two passages are actually taken from the same chapter in Livy's History of Rome written by Titus Livius, and they took place supposedly in the same year. I think it's 163 BCE, and they are really like basically on the same page. And in both instances, as far as I know, the only source that we have for these two passages are his histories, so his book. No one else says that. So we have the same quality and quantity of data for both. It's one historian saying that, I think about 150 years after the fact. The question is, do you doubt one of these passages more than the other? And if yes, why? And obviously the answer is yes.
Yeah, and this is where
because they have different prior probability.
This is where the Christian chimes in, says you just have a presupposition against miracles, and but I think the best way to resonate with the unbeliever about this sort of, or the believer about this sort of thing, is to bring up stuff like this. So I think Matt Dillahunty was correct in what he was saying, but he just wasn't complete in saying in what occasions do we say that eyewitness testimony is just a claim, and what occasion it's actually evidence for. Because the Christian listening right now, they don't believe that Joseph Smith saw a pillar of light over his head and as the brightness of the sun, and that Jesus Christ himself, the Lord, it says on the right, the Lord appeared to him and said, "This is my beloved son, hear him." And that Jesus actually said to Joseph Smith that all the religions are wrong in the world. Like, this is Joseph Smith's own hand writing this stuff, and yet they don't believe it. Why not? But yet they believe Paul's hand when he says that Jesus appeared to him.
Yeah, and I wouldn't really harp so much on this, because I think, Matt is basically correct. Like for my taste, he didn't emphasize the issue of prior probability enough. But the thing is, like, I'm part of a couple of Jesus mythicism Facebook groups, so I can see the damage that this like bad epistemology of history does. Like, if you are a member of that group, you should be ashamed of yourself.
Yeah. So if I was to summarize my critique of Matt here, is if you think that claims in a text can't be evidence for the reality of the claim, I think you just have a bad epistemology of history, and broadly a bad epistemology. But you need to actually explain how it is that those claims can be evidence, and I think that you can do that within a sound epistemology. It's just that his broader point that claims about a resurrection aren't evidence for a resurrection, I think is true. It's just that it's not true when you apply it to a lot of other types of claims.
Yeah.
Do you guys remember off the top of your head if there was anything else Matt said that you disagreed with?
Yeah, that was one other thing. I wanted to address.
Okay, I'll keep playing it then.
Yeah.
The whole resurrection claim is a big case of special pleading, in that we have zero evidence of anyone ever being resurrected in the sense that it's described in the Jesus story, where somebody is dead and seen to be dead, and, well, 3 days later, or a day and a half if you do the math, they rise from the dead. That we have no evidence for that. We have no reason to think it's possible, and all the evidence about reality seems to show that it would be impossible. This is not a claim that miracles cannot occur. It's simply we don't have evidence for that. When I say something like, in order to reach to the supernatural as a potential explanation, you would first have to show that the supernatural is real and can interact with reality. I'm talking about just having a sound epistemology. It's not the fault of sound epistemology that claims about the supernatural are unable to meet those standards. Simply saying, well, you can't exclude these claims are the evidence for. No, they're not. They're the claims. When I'm presented with a new claim, or even a claim I already accept, there's a number of questions, a little heuristic model that I go through in my head. Now, I don't do all these all the time, and they're not always explicit. But the types of things you ask yourself if you're trying to be skeptical about something is, number one, do I already believe it? And by the way, if the answer to that's yes, that doesn't mean you shouldn't question it. You should still question it, even if you already believe it. Otherwise, these conversations would be pointless.
Yeah, I think this is great advice Matt's giving right now, that especially when it comes to deeply held beliefs, try to seek out opinions that are opposite to your own, and always be more skeptical of what you already believe than the opposite. I think that's a good rule of thumb to if you value truth.
The second one is this claim consistent with my current understanding of reality? Because if it is, then we're talking about something that's mundane, and it's going to require a different standard of evidence than something that completely undermines the well-founded understanding of reality. The next question, and these aren't in a specific order, which of my beliefs would I have to change if I were to accept this new claim? And so if I accept this new claim, how is that going to fundamentally undermine other things that I already understand and believe and accept about reality? And is the evidence for this new thing so overwhelming that it trumps all of the evidence for this other thing? What about my life would change? What evidence is there for the contrary? And then it gets to, what do I know about the person who's making the claim? In the case of my mom telling me she's seen demons, I know a lot about the person, and I generally find him truthful, or her truthful. I just don't find that her claim is in and of itself sufficient evidence. Does this person who's relaying the information...
Yeah, that's another great point by Matt. Like, even if my own wife, who I love, comes to me with a serious face and says, Doug, I saw a man carry his own head around his arm and down the street and was walking, I'm not going to believe that actually happened in history, even if it's coming from someone I love deeply and trust.
Yeah, and actually, if I myself saw that, I wouldn't believe it, right? Because another important point is that people think that personal experience, something that you experience firsthand, is somehow has a privileged position in epistemology. So you're more justified in believing in something that you experience, right? But that's not necessarily the case. And actually, the kind of evidence that I would like to see for various extraordinary claims is not personal, me experiencing it personally. It's almost the opposite. It's that information being accessible to everyone. Because if you think about like really weird claims that you nevertheless accept as factual, like for example, time slows down the faster you move, or lengths contract in strong gravitational fields, or elementary particles are both a particle and a wave at the same time. I've never experienced any of that myself, but I don't require it. The point is that this type of information is publicly accessible. It's accessible to everyone, right? And it's been verified by large numbers of people who are experts, and it's been verified by ways that make sure that there isn't like tampering with the data, and the results are like under scrutiny, and they are repeatable and stuff like that. So personal experience doesn't mean that you should be more justified in believing that, right? It's almost the opposite in some cases.
Yeah, I agree.
Do they have a motivation to deceive me, including the, hey, why would I say something like that unless I was telling the truth? Why would I say that he appeared to women when we know we don't trust women? You cannot use that as if it's evidence for, because it could go either way. It could be the double bluff type scenario. And in any case, appealing to that with regard to testimony still doesn't get you to the truth of the matter. Now you're just talking about how reliable are these people in other circumstances, and should we extend that reliability? But the fact that I tell you 10 things and 8 of them are correct tells you nothing at all about whether the other 2 are correct. Each of those claims has to stand and fall on its own merits and its own evidence. Is there any known mechanism to support this? Claiming that magic did it, that, Jesus was special, or God is special, and God is able to, exempt things from what we understand to be the laws of reality and these limitations, call it magic or whatever you want. it's a case of special pleading, and you would need to demonstrate that this is an actual viable candidate explanation. We put together all the facts. You list the candidate explanations for this, and that's all you get to pull from. Because if the candidate explanations are conspiracies, which we know occur, legend, which we know occurs, mistakes, which we know occur, exaggerations, which we know occur, and all these other things, and then resurrection, something we have zero supporting evidence for. We have lots of claims, but nothing to show that this ever did happen or could happen. You don't get to include that. You'd have to demonstrate why that is the more likely explanation. And I don't know how you can do that when you can't demonstrate that this is something that can occur.
Yeah, this is basically Matt saying what we just said earlier, right? It's these are claims because of the low prior probability of it happening, and shouldn't be put in the evidence bucket for it actually happening.
Yeah, and by the way, I found out what my second complaint was, and it's even less important than the first one. It seemed to me at a couple of points that Matt was actually overemphasizing the importance of having contemporary sources for an event, right? Again, if you have an event with very low prior probability, like a resurrection, then you better have contemporary sources, right? But again, this isn't a general rule, and I have seen people, atheists specifically, saying about various claims in history, there wasn't anyone present reporting it or anyone contemporary with the event. Therefore, I'm not going to accept it as historical. And that's, again, like bad epistemology of history. It's not a general rule. You don't need to have contemporary sources to conclude that something probably happened, right?
Okay, I'm gonna fast forward it to the back and forth where it actually got kind of heated at one point, but I'm trying to think if there's anything. This is probably the hardest, the toughest thing to get through for Christians. That your personal experience on things like this are probably wrong, and it just it offends them. It's like, you don't believe me that I saw this ghost or this angel or this devil. These are real powerful experiences. And so when they have personally had those experiences themselves, they can believe Paul when he talks about his Damascus Road experience. You know, they can resonate with that. But yet there's just so many cases in history of beliefs, claims that they don't believe. I just don't know how. Then they just blame the devil, I guess, or whatever. But anyhow, let's get on to the back and forth.
If I could respond to the content I just heard from Matt, what I heard from you, it sounded to me, if I was to take everything you said and just kind of go back and listen and kind of put it all into categories, because it was very sort of wandering in my opinion. A lot of stuff was vague. What if, but not tying it to specific evidence, not tying it to any of the details of the first century. Other stuff was, in my opinion, bad analogies, like comparing it to the Doyle's fallacy. That I don't know if that's a real fallacy, but Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had Houdini telling him, "Hey, this is fake. It's just a trick. Don't believe it." He had every reason to doubt it. Whereas with the crucifixion, that doesn't parallel. It's just not a.
It doesn't parallel. There's no reasons to doubt it. This is so much a difference in worldview of how you see the world. There's every reason to doubt this, Mike. Every reason to doubt this. When's the last time you've seen a dead person come back to life? When's the last time you know anybody who knows a dead person come back to life, that has seen it with their own eyes? There's just so many reasons to doubt this, and that's the big one. But we could just go on all day of reasons to doubt this. And what Matt Dillahunty was saying earlier is that you don't need to have specific evidence to tie this into. All you need is to doubt that it actually happened in the first place, to not believe it. Go ahead, Kamil.
Yeah, I think now there is an interesting dynamic going on, because if you watched Matt's opening, Matt didn't really put forward like an alternative explanation for the various facts relevant to the resurrection. So now Mike is trying to push him to do that, right? Because he thinks, Mike, that Matt is going to put forward some variation of an alternative explanation that Mike is familiar with. So he feels comfortable probably that he's going to be able to shoot it down. So if Matt, for example, says it was probably a hallucination, then Mike has like a stock responses in his NPC dialogue tree. But Matt was just spending his time explaining the flaws in the epistemology, and it was actually very productive that he did not allow himself to be dragged into the discussion about minutia of like of the gospel accounts and first century Palestine, right? It's much more productive to talk about the epistemology than to go into like a swoon theory and stuff like that.
So, yeah, I agree with that. That was one of the aspects that I liked, is that he did play the role of a skeptical epistemology quite well, and rejected Mike's sort of attempt to suggest that the only way to reliably do historical investigation is to commit to concrete explanations.
A parallel at all.
It parallels to the Cottingley fairies.
But that doesn't parallel to the resurrection.
Sure it does.
How so?
It's a claim of something paranormal and supernatural that Doyle accepted because he could not find a better explanation than that it was real.
Okay, but that's not the evidence for the resurrection. This is what happened in your discussion with
There
Mike.
is no evidence for the resurrection. There are claims.
That's actually something I'd like to look at really quickly, because that was I heard you make, or I heard
This I did not appreciate from Cameron Bertuzzi. He's supposed to be a moderator, and this is Mike's job to. They're going to talk about definitions and so forth.
you say that a few times in your opening,
But I really saw this as Cameron Bertuzzi bailing Mike out here.
Matt. So claims versus evidence. Would you mind defining those two? Like, what's that distinction?
Well, so a claim is an assertion that something is such and so, and evidence is actually evidence that supports the fact that it's thus and so. And so, like,
Yeah,
and
if you noticed, in his definition of evidence, he repeated the word evidence. And I'm wondering if this is because it's very difficult for him to define the word evidence in a way that would exclude claims, like other claims, and would still sound reasonable in the context that they are talking about, like first century, like texts from first century, coming from ancient literature, right?
Yeah. Matt would have been better off just to say something like claims that eyewitness testimony is, for some claims, good, and for other claims, bad. And that the real issue is, how do we tell the difference between eyewitness claims that testify that they saw a giant green lizard versus they saw a puppy dog running down the street? Like, I think that's the main issue, is this issue of prior probability. What makes an eyewitness claim better or worse? Like, I am of the opinion, I think, was it Hume who said that eyewitness testimony can't be sufficient enough evidence for extraordinary claims?
Yeah, so here's one way to look at it. If we look at the class of instances where we claim mundane things, for example, I have a dog, what we find is that it's really, really common to claim such things as I have a dog when you actually do have a dog, as opposed to when you don't. But when we look at a different class of claim, for example, I saw a god and interacted with it and talked with it, a common explanation of that is like delusion, illusion, hallucination, a variety of different bad things about our epistemology. Whereas the God actually existing and causing that experience is an uncommon explanation. So there's like a difference, is that people tend to be really reliable when it comes to making claims about them owning dogs, but they don't tend to be very reliable when it comes to them interacting with gods. And this is a premise that even Christians agree with, because they think that the accounts of Muslims interacting with Allah, or Mormons interacting with the Mormon God, they think that their attribution of their experience is wrong. Maybe they think it's demons, but maybe they just think these people people are mistaken.
Oh, Cam, you don't even have to go outside of Christianity. Like I went to a Pentecostal church for a time. I'll even say the word most Christians think Pentecostals are nuts. And that when they say they've experienced Jesus on a Sunday morning, that they're crazy. There's a lot of Christians who think like that. And so even within the own religion, they do not believe that every claim is actually a claim supporting that what they claim actually happened, that they met Jesus.
Yeah, and I would also try to take this completely outside the realm of religion and just give an example of something like alien abductions, right? Like that's, as far as we know, that the claim being made is much more often a result of, again, bad epistemology, like sleep paralysis, hallucination, mental illness, or just lying, right, for money or attention or something like that. Much more often than, as far as we can tell, aliens actually abducting people. But a claim, I have a dog, being made is much more often a result of a dog actually existing and being owned by the person making the claim. So you don't have to. I think it's important to say that this distinction is about prior probability, not about like natural versus supernatural, right? So you can take that off completely out of the equation, and everything that we are saying still applies.
But if you're a PhD scientist like Hugh Ross, you just say aliens are they're demons. It's like there's just no getting around it. It's just
but it doesn't actually have to be about the prior probability of these claims actually being real. It can be about the prior probability of the fact of somebody claiming something, the thing that they claim actually occurring being the explanation of why they claimed it. And that's the important thing, is that like we're looking at like the frequency at which the real explanation turns out to be that the claim is true versus the frequency that it turns out to be false. And there are different frequencies for different types of claims. And claims like I have a dog, the frequency at which the real explanation of me claiming that is that I do have a dog is really quite high, which is why we generally believe people when they claim to have dogs.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Cam, most people don't think the way you just described, and so that's the main problem. But let's move on.
Mike was the number of times, I jotted down notes, there were a number of times where he would say, like, archaeological evidence supports this. Well, that is simply false. Because what Mike was saying was that when we talk about the tomb in Joseph of Arimathea, it was this particular type of tomb. And then archaeologists pointed out that that is consistent with types of tombs at the time. That is not archaeological evidence supporting it. That is a confirmation that the people of the time were talking about facts of the people of the time. It's not archaeological evidence for Jesus being buried, for Jesus existing, for Joseph of Arimathea, for Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. It's nothing. It is simply saying that when people talked about a tomb, this is something that actually happened. And when you view it like that, it's roughly the equivalent of archaeologists in 2,000 years finding evidence of buildings in New York and saying this is evidence for Spider-Man.
So if you were to have, let's say that you have in the first century a description of the tomb, and then we come back 2,000 years later, we dig in the area and we find that tombs don't exist in the area, nothing like it exists. And in fact, the description of the tomb, it seems like it couldn't even physically exist in the area of Jerusalem at all. That would probably count as evidence against the tomb, right?
Yes, it would.
So when we find a description of a tomb that fits the description, the guy that's described as burying it, it fits the context, it fits the archaeology that we discover. How does this not count as corroborative evidence that this is more likely true than before we knew about it?
Yeah, because the kind of symmetry that Mike is imagining doesn't actually exist. It doesn't apply. It's possible to falsify a hypothesis by discovering anachronisms and historical accuracies, but a lack of anachronisms and historical accuracies does not count as evidence for the claim actually being true, right? Because a lack of anachronisms is equally as likely on the hypothesis that it's just a fictional story written by someone who wasn't a complete moron and wasn't like locked up in a basement and never saw a burial.
Yeah, and this goes back to the point that I emphasized earlier is that it's just an example of Mike having a poor epistemology. He just doesn't get it. Like, he doesn't get that when you have a competing explanation that equally accounts for the observation you're making, it can't be evidence for one versus the other.
Yeah, and maybe I'm thinking that maybe this is also a result of another thing, and it's that apologists in general are really bad at making a distinction between the accounts, like the texts that say something, and what the texts are about, right? Like, we don't actually have the empty tomb, so the evidence that an explanation needs to account for is not the empty tomb, it's the account of the empty tomb. And that's a very important distinction. It's like this difference between a map and the actual place. And if you only have a map, then the question is, do you have a map of an actual place, or is it a map of like the Middle Earth or something like that, right?
Yeah, and you can create maps of things that aren't real.
I'm trying to think
exactly.
of a very simple example, and I can't, of how to explain this to guys like Mike. And I'm thinking, like, imagine a story of the giant green lizard taking his foot and smashing a Ford Model T. Is that right? There's Model T Fords. And the story describes this Model T Ford exactly. And you can go back in history and verify it. Would this be evidence, Mike, that the giant green lizards exist? Because the author captured it perfectly.
My analogy that I came up with in discussions on the YouTube comment section after the debate was, if I write a story about me fighting a fire-breathing dragon in a McDonald's restaurant, and the story accounts a really accurate description of the McDonald's, does it mean the story is like more likely true? It's the accurate description isn't even evidence that I actually went to a McDonald's on the day, but didn't fight a dragon, right? So that would be an argument against guys like Bart Ehrman, who basically think that you can just delete all the supernatural stuff from the Gospels and apply some kind of method
on, Kamil. I'm getting a communication in right now from Mike Winger, and he says he understands what we're saying and he'll never do it again. So we're good.
Good to know. I can send him an alternative version of his presentation without all these problems in it.
You gave me $1 million, and in 2,000 years, somebody researches and find out there was no such thing as dollars now. That would be disconfirming evidence. But if they find out there were dollars now, the only thing that is evidence of is that I am speaking accurately about immaterial tertiary facts about the time. It doesn't tell them anything at all about whether or not you gave me $1 million. Of course, people in their time are likely to describe the mundane. It would be absurd. It would actually be more miraculous to find out that they described a tomb that wasn't likely or probable for the area than not.
So outside of Jerusalem, outside of Palestine, where it's theorized that these Gospels were written, 3 of the 4 are supposedly written outside Palestine. In your opinion, you take the late date. So you're saying that they were written, 30 to 90. I've heard you say 30 to 90 years later, which I never heard that late. But let's say that that's the case. They're written outside Palestine. Yet they seem to know details about the Sanhedrin, details about the empty tomb, about the kinds of tombs, details about the debates between the Pharisees and Sadducees, details like in John, it records that there was a sycamore tree in Jericho, and those trees didn't even grow outside of Palestine in the area where it's thought John was written. Like, how did they know Zacchaeus climbed a sycamore tree? Like, these are confirmatory details saying that, hey, this stuff, when you put it all together, there's a reason why, Matt, historians would roll their eyes at the stuff that you're saying about how, those are just claims, they don't count. Rather, they're adding it all together.
They're not evidence for the resurrection. Confirming that somebody is accurately relaying elements of a story does not confirm the other elements of the story. Saying that Zacchaeus, what's that?
Sometimes it does.
No, it absolutely does not. It cannot. If I make 10 claims, the fact that 8 of them are true tells you nothing at all about whether the other 2 are true. Nothing at all. Each claim is independent.
Yeah, see, this is what Matt said right now is very, very powerful, and it just bothers Christians because they think, and I understand why, it's very intuitive, that if my wife, I've trusted her all my life, and so if I trust her with 90% of the stuff she says, then I should really trust her on the other 10%. because she's been shown to be reliable. So why doubt her? This is how they think. Were you going to say something, Cam?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an element of truth to what Mike is saying. We can gain increased trust in the reliability of people, but ultimately we do still have to grapple with the categories that their claims fit within and the differences in how reliable people's claims are in those categories. And so what I'm saying here is that when we do find that we have a friend and they consistently tell you things that turn out to be honest, they turn out to be reliable, we do come to trust them when they tell us something about their lives. We don't approach them with distrust because we find them to be a trustworthy, reliable friend. Now, I think we've all probably had experiences with people who we do notice have this sort of like problematic habituation or like habitual tendency to lie about things, just even in their personal life, things that are mundane. And for those people, yes, we actually do develop reduced trust and reduced confidence in what they relay to us. But going back to the beginning of what I was saying, it's important that we still pay attention to the categories in which their claims fall, whether or not they fall on claims that are typically things that are true about history or true about things that happen in the personal experience of humans, or whether or not they are things that are wildly improbable and are things that we don't have very solid evidence for in any other domain of life.
Yeah, and just like the Christian, I think, desires guys like us to not have a presupposition against miracles, I would beg the Christian back, please don't have a presupposition for miracles. Like, if you value truth, you would say, well, maybe it's a miracle, maybe it's not. Maybe Jesus is complete, his resurrection is complete rubbish. Maybe it is. Are you willing to actually entertain that thought?
Yeah, and the thing is that even if we grant that God exists and we grant that God has the capacity to intervene in the world and make these miraculous things occur, it's still the case that God doesn't commonly do this. In fact, it's extremely rare, even on the assumption that God does these things in the world. So it isn't that we have a presupposition against miracles, it's that miracles aren't usually the explanation of things in the world. And that's true even if God is true, even if God is real.
Did you see my true and false? Did you guys see my true and false questionnaire? That was one of the questions. Even if a God exists, someone rise from the dead is very improbable.
Well, even if Yahweh exists, right, like the God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac, just go ask an Orthodox Jew. I think one of the best lines of evidence against the resurrection is natural revelation and natural theology. So I can, for example, I can make predictions, reliable predictions about what God, Yahweh, will intend to do in the future, which is mind-blowing. But I, for example, predict then when I let go of this pen, Yahweh will not intend to cause miracle and send the pen flying across the room, right?
Upwards.
That's the whole point of natural theology, which is like one branch of theology that's actually being done by theologians of various religions. And that motivates, it's one of the reasons that motivates the low prior probability of the resurrection taking place. If you want to overcome that, you have to present evidence that suggests that Yahweh would be interested in raising Jesus from the dead. But the problem is that you can't use the Old New Testament to do that, because the authors of the New Testament, when they wrote it, already believed that Jesus was in fact raised from the dead. So of course they are going to say that Yahweh intended, right? You would have to find some independent source.
Yeah, it
you can
becomes
use
like
the
a
Old
circular
Testament
argument.
Yeah, you can use the Old Testament, but then there are other issues with that.
Where I think
This is exactly
vague generalities meet the actual details of the history of things. So what we do is we can take the claims and say, hey, the Gospels tell us that Jesus was crucified, that he was buried, that the disciples were despondent and had lost hope. Now, when we look at other messianic movements of the time and we see that they all died as soon as the Messiah character died, we go, oh, that corroborates the idea that the disciples were despondent at the time. And we see in Tacitus that it says that when Christ was crucified, that it had checked for the moment the following of Christ and later it exploded. That also is a confirmatory detail.
How about the Mandeans? the followers of John the Baptist. They are still around.
Yeah, and John the
And
Baptist.
they actually, they believe that Jesus is a false Messiah.
I actually, Kamil, I had one of my subscribers tell me in the comment section of one of my videos that this is what led them out of Christianity, is reading about John the Baptist, and that Pilate and others believed that John the Baptist was Jesus risen from the dead, and they could have shown that to be false. All they had to do was present the body where they knew it was laid, because Pilate gave it back to John the Baptist's disciples. They knew where John the Baptist's headless body was. All they had to do...
Are you talking about Herod, not Pilate?
Oh, sorry, Herod. Yes, thanks, Cam. All they had to do was present the body, and yet they didn't. And here's an example of the New Testament of people believing in the resurrection of a certain individual and were mistaken.
So
the only thing that's required to get over that, the only thing that's required to get over that is for people to believe the story, not the story to be true. The story doesn't have to be true in order to compel this. What needs to happen is for people need to believe that the story is true.
Mm-hmm. The problem I have with this is that these are just super vague generalities. I want to hear you take these generalities and apply them specifically to the details around the death and resurrection of Christ.
No, what you're asking me to do is to prove facts wrong. And it's irrelevant as to whether or not I can do that, as I said at the outset. These aren't vague things I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is not evidence against the resurrection. It is a demonstration of an epistemology that is sound, and the resurrection claims do not rise to that level.
Yeah, Mike really wants an alternative hypothesis that he can poke his hole into, right?
Yeah.
This is really effective.
One of the first questions I ask Christians when I'm talking to them, whether it's live stream or not, is, do you need evidence or proof against your position, or can you just doubt what you currently believe enough that you'll just stop believing? And this is what Matt's getting at here, is that I don't have to come up with any other explanation. I just doubt what I'm being presented right now as saying you're unreasonable to believe this.
I don't know if we've gone into this yet, but Kamil, I would love you to present that analogy about the dice with respect to best explanation, because I really think it's helpful.
Sure. So basically, when the historical evidence for the resurrection is presented, it's almost always is framed in the framework of abductive reasoning, so reasoning to the best explanation. So because we don't have a time machine and we can actually check, the question isn't really did Jesus rise from the dead? The question is it reasonable to believe it? And if the resurrection hypothesis is the most reasonable explanation that we can think of, then so goes the argument. We should accept it as factual. But the problem is that there could be, if you have 5 hypotheses, it could be the case that one of them is the most reasonable explanation, but you should nevertheless reject it, because the probability of it being false is still higher than the probability of it being true. Which sounds really weird. Like if you have 5 explanations and one of them is the best, that's the one that you should go for. But I have 2 analogies to explain this, right? So imagine there is a murder and you have 5 suspects, and there's one of them has the most evidence pointing against him. But it still could be the case that the amount of evidence is not enough, it's not sufficient to convict anyone, including the guy that is most likely the perpetrator, right? That's one illustration. And the other one is this, imagine you have a 6-sided die, and the die is weighted so that when you roll it, the number 6 comes up much more often than it should have if it was a fair dice. So let's say that 6 comes up 30% of the time, as opposed to 12.5, which is what it should have been. And imagine you are in a casino and you can bet money, and you, in the first scenario, you have to bet on which number is going to be the number that comes up when you roll the dice. If you have to bet on that, then it obviously makes sense to bet on number 6, because that's the number that has the highest probability. So if you know that the die is weighted, that's the most rational bet. But if you are given a second situation, if you're in a second situation, and then you can place the bet on either number 6 or on any other number except 6. So if you bet $1 million on number 6 and you actually roll 6, then you win. But then if you bet on any other number, you get the money if 1 to 5 is the outcome, right? Well, in that scenario, betting on 6 is no longer the reasonable option, because then the probability is 30% against 70%, right? It's much more probable that any other number other than 6 is going to come up, even though 6 is the most probable number, right?
So relating
And
this
Yeah.
to what Matt was saying is basically, Mike is going to say, come on, Matt, give me an explanation. Give me another separate number. And Matt's saying, no, it's more probable that explanation 1 through 5 is more likely in aggregate than yours, number 6. So I'm betting on the other 5. Is that what
Yeah, and to summarize the point, it's just to like bring it home, it's not necessarily the case that the best explanation among many is the one that's more probably true than not. So being the best explanation doesn't mean it's greater than 50% probability.
Yeah, but I would say that like this line of argumentation, basically saying, yeah, okay, it could be the best explanation, but it still doesn't mean that you should accept it as more likely true than not. It seems to be really like weak ass. So I would be much bolder and actually say that there are alternative explanations that are like vastly more probable than
I agree.
the resurrection hypothesis. Like, I would be willing to defend at least one of them. So yeah.
Okay, let's move on.
Epistemology. I think we're shifting gears now. We're no longer talking about the history, verifying historical details.
Is it unreasonable? That is epistemology, and that is absolutely all about epistemology, which is what this debate has to be about.
Okay, let me explain what I'm saying. So I presented a two-part case, right? My one part is, hey, we have these non-miraculous, reasonably believable facts of history, right. And then the second part is, and I think the resurrection best explains it. So you see the argument against both sides. One side is you're arguing against the evidence itself, in which case I'm trying to say generalities don't do it. We need details. And then you're also saying epistemologically that you can't conclude the resurrection because, and this sounds like circular reasoning, because
it's not circular.
You can't prove it until you prove it. I'll reject the evidence that proves it because you have to prove it, but I won't allow evidence to prove the thing that I'm saying you can't prove. It just seems painfully circular.
No, sir. Circular reasoning is when the conclusion is entailed in the premise. And my conclusion is not the resurrection didn't occur or that supernatural can't occur. My conclusion is that the resurrection hasn't met its burden of proof. And the fact that it can't do that or seems to be unable to do that is not circular. And it's not a problem for epistemology. It's a problem for the resurrection, which is why I'm pointing out you had a two-part case. Here's these 12 facts, which, okay, some of them I find incredibly questionable. And, some of the sources that you cited, I have issues with, but that's not your fault.
Could we like pause and like maybe look at this two-part case real quick and like maybe just go through the first part and see which facts you take issue with, or not? Because I don't want to call them facts, right? Because these are just like what.
Yeah. So this is the moderator basically like playing in Mike's team, because he's trying to push Matt exactly where Mike.
It's the second time he's done it as well.
Yeah.
Cameron Bertuzzi, if you ever watch this, stop it. You're not going to get atheists coming on your show anymore if you keep doing that.
Mike said
I actually would like to praise James from Modern Day Debate, because I think he's really good at not doing this. And he's also been really great at bringing on moderators from different worldviews who also don't do this. So kudos to James from Modern Day Debate.
And I don't know what
it's a really great channel.
I don't know what they agreed upon before this all took place. Like if Cameron Bertuzzi was basically the third wheel allowed to jump in at any time, or if he's... I got the impression from this debate that Cameron Bertuzzi's job was to keep time, and that was it. But I could be wrong.
Most historians
I'm trying to go through the list. It's really easy.
Mike, can you put that back up on the screen?
Oh, I can. It's going to take me just a moment to do that because I closed it.
It's fine. So the death of Jesus.
Yeah.
Isn't in any way evidence for the resurrection. Yes, it's a required thing that he must have died before he's resurrected, but the fact that he died is irrelevant to whether or not he was actually resurrected.
But do you agree with that? Like, do you agree that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate?
I have no idea. To me, this is largely a storybook whose veracity cannot be verified. I don't have any way to investigate this. There are no contemporary accounts. Not even in the Bible there aren't contemporary accounts. We don't see the sort of things that we would expect. We don't see, the Romans reporting on. It's not like we found a document that shows, hey, here's the date we crucified Yeshua ben Joseph. That just doesn't exist.
This is what I was talking about. This is, I think, Matt overemphasizing the importance of having contemporary sources and saying we don't see the kind of things that we would expect to see, like Romans reporting that they crucified, Yeshua ben Joseph. But we wouldn't expect that, even if the crucifixion actually happened, which I think everyone thinks it did, except mythicists. So yeah, that's unreasonably high standard.
Although, remember, it is about Pontius Pilate. So there are people who think that Jesus died, but that he died at the hands of the Jews directly. And there are also people who think that he died and that he died, or that we don't actually know when it is that he died. Because, for example, Irenaeus claims that it happened under Claudius. And there's also, another instance where it's set in time before. But most historians definitely think that he died under Pontius Pilate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if the claim is that a guy, especially like a messianic pretender in Second Temple Judaism, or even later, was killed because he was a messianic pretender, you don't need contemporary accounts for that. That's like the prior probability is sufficiently high that even like highly, not mythological, but like theological texts are more than enough to establish that, at least for me. Yeah.
I don't tend to hear about anybody else who saw zombies rise up and march on Jerusalem when the crucifixion occurred. We don't have any reportings of the sky growing dark or the temple veil splitting.
Those things have nothing to do with my case.
I'm talking about, yes, okay, I will agree, because I just said that the death of Jesus has nothing to do with the resurrection, apart from that it was necessary. But these are things that are part of the same story, the same telling, sometimes just a handful of verses apart. As a matter of fact, if we go with the ending of Mark 16 at 8.
This is a huge, huge point that I hope, I wish that it resonates with Christians. When you read any other text outside the Bible where you have a mundane claim right next to a miraculous type claim, fantastical claim, doesn't that lower your confidence just a scotch that you're reading history? Just be honest with yourself. And this is Matt's point here. He's saying we have all these mundane type facts, in quotes, right next to the fantastical. And in any other area in your life, Mr. or Mrs. Christian, you would lower your confidence on that, even the mundane stuff that's found right next to it. I always give the example of Clark Kent and the Superman. Clark Kent wearing glasses, mundane. Works at a newspaper shop, mundane. Has a girlfriend named Lois, mundane. The same guy, though, can cut steel with his eyes? Oh, maybe he doesn't have a girlfriend named Lois now. Maybe this is a story.
There's nothing other than the women don't tell anybody. So when I'm looking at the Bible, I have to consider its reliability. And so when it says, hey, when Jesus was crucified, the temple veil split, the sky went dark, and zombies rose up and marched on Jerusalem, if we don't have any independent accounts of those things, isn't that preposterous? Do you think zombies marched on Jerusalem?
And I think that is a really ridiculous way to put it. And zombies, hold on a second. Let's be mature here. This is what I see all the time when I encounter and engage with the atheist community. It is constant mockery. It's like painful for Christians. They ask me,
constant mockery, painful for Christians. I have a
well, and not only that, he implicitly called Matt immature.
This is what I call, I know you are, but what am I, apologetics? It's like junior high.
I call it being a special snowflake.
Yeah. I'm going to say this as gently as I can. Mike Winger, you need to get stronger emotionally, that you can take this sort of thing, especially if you're going to be a YouTuber. I know you take a lot of crap as it is, and I applaud you for it. But my advice to Christians in general, if you get like angry if someone uses the word zombies when referring to Matthew 27, you need to like back away and check yourself. I think I'm thinking back in my life. I'm not once accused. I don't think I've once accused someone of mocking me or mocking my beliefs, or even when I was a Christian and being upset about it. Like, from the Christian worldview, you should just accept that the gospel is foolishness to those who are perishing. And you expect any less? Like, this should be the default position for you guys, that people will not understand your non-Christians won't understand you, and that they'll mock your beliefs. Like, accept it. Get stronger. Is that too harsh? Asking people to get stronger? Probably is.
I mean, how do you handle it, Mike? Because the constant mockery of Christian faith, like, let's just take it straight, Matt. There's no zombies in Scripture. It talks about several people who were raised saints coming into the city. This, however, has nothing to do with my case. There are the scholars who would reject, I don't reject it, but who would reject that account in Matthew. They still would accept the facts that I've given you today.
Yeah.
So you're shifting the burden of proof to where I'm supposed to prove.
I'm not. I was
Scripture to talk about a historical case for the resurrection.
I was asked to explain something, and I'm trying to do so. The reliability of Scripture in general is key to whether or not we can write about it on the other things. The facts that historians will attest to, and by the way, some of them attest to more than I think they should, are simply mundane things. It's not like there's historians who are saying, yes, the resurrection occurred. What they say, and what you attested to in some of these discussions, is there are people who claim to have seen Jesus after he was dead. I have no problem with the fact that people claimed to see Jesus after he was dead.
Good.
That isn't evidence for the resurrection. That is the claim. Hey, I saw somebody. And by the way, as you read it,
okay, and then Matt uses the word.
They see him in different ways. Saul has this road to Damascus thing with an apparition.
Matt uses the word apparition, and they spend the next 10 minutes, I think, talking about this. And I'm just going to bypass that. Matt basically said, "Sorry, Mike, I shouldn't use the word apparition."
And then Mike makes a bunch of a whole big deal about it.
Yeah, it's silly in my opinion. So I'm going to fast forward that part and go to here.
Is available, and that is stupid.
Oh, what's stupid?
Okay, so would you say this? If I was you, I would. Let me say. I'm gonna be Matt Dillahunty for a second. Tell me if I'm saying it right.
You failed last time, but we'll get there.
I think you demonstrated that no evidence effectively doesn't matter. But we'll put it this way.
Oh my God! No. No.
Can you conceive?
Oh my God! No,
I can't. Evidence. Can you conceive of any? Let me just get this out.
Yeah, let Mike.
No, I cannot let you get this out.
You talked for like 2 minutes. I said one sentence and you're interrupting me.
That's because your sentence was to accuse me of evidence doesn't matter.
That's how a debate works, Matt. You got to let me talk.
Not.
This isn't your show, man. You got to let me talk.
I don't have to stay, is what I'm saying. Would you stop characterizing me as if evidence doesn't matter, when what I've said to you is that evidence is all that matters, and the evidence for your claim does not rise to the level of reasonableness in my estimation.
Do you disagree with that, Mike, in hindsight, do you think Matt's lying to you right now? For you to say evidence doesn't matter to Matt, or at least on this one specific case of the resurrection, like, do you understand, Mike, that what you did was misrepresent him? I know you hate it when people misrepresent you, right? Like, in hindsight, would you reach out to Matt and say, yeah, I was wrong for saying that? I'm very curious what Mike would say here.
I think this gets to another very important point. It has to do with the whole thing, and I think Matt has been criticized for it by other Christians. You know, he says that he doesn't know what it would take to convince him of Christianity, but if Christianity is true, then God does know, right? So he doesn't have to, because if there's a God, he knows that, so that's fine. First of all, I wouldn't say that. Like, I can imagine things that would convince me of Christianity, and we've talked about it before. But also, like, when Mike hears Matt say that, he like glees about it because he thinks this is showing that Matt is being unreasonable, that he is being like stubborn or like hyper skeptical. At one point, for example, Matt says that even if it was the case that the resurrection happened, that wouldn't necessarily prove that Christianity is true, because there can be other explanations. For example, like a trickster god from a different religion, like Loki, decided to play a prank and raise Jesus from the dead or something like that. But the problem is, like, this doesn't show that Matt is unreasonable. That shows the flaw in the claim itself, right? Like, if you make a claim and it's like so difficult to establish that the claim is true, then that's not the problem of the people being unreasonable. It's the problem with the claim, right? Like one really interesting hypothetical is, like, imagine there's a person that knocks on your door. You open the door and the person says, "Hi, I'm all powerful." What kind of test do you run to prove that he's actually telling the truth? Like, if you tell him, "Okay, raise this person from the dead," and he does it, are you reasonable in concluding that that person is all powerful? I don't think so, because all that it shows is that the list of powers that this person has includes the resurrection, but it doesn't prove that the list is like infinitely long or that it includes all things that you can possibly do. So that's not me being unreasonable. That's the problem with the claim, "I am all powerful."
Yeah, but my advice to Matt, if he ever watches this, is you don't have to. You can continue telling Christians, "I don't know what would convince me," but you could say something like, "I know what would increase my confidence just a little bit, or make me want to investigate this just a little bit more," and that is, an amputee that in life getting his limb back in the name of Jesus. You don't have to say, "Well, okay, I'm convinced that Jesus actually did this, not a different God," and blah blah blah. But at least you would say, something inside me is changed. I've seen this. I've had this experience. My confidence has gone up a little bit because of this. And so if you say that, I think that would appease the Christians greatly.
You know what I say, and I only say that because I'm such an asshole. I say this fact alone would not convince me, but it would be a great component of a cumulative case. And I only say that because I know how Christians love their cumulative cases.
Yeah. There is a cumulative case against the resurrection, by the way.
Is there any conceivable evidence in your mind that would give you the resurrection of Christ and God did it? Is there any conceivable evidence?
I have no idea, as I've said umpteen times, and as you paraphrased me at the beginning, what that evidence would be, which is completely irrelevant, because I'm not saying that I can't be convinced. I'm saying I don't know what would convince me. But what I'm also saying is what has convinced other people is not a good standard of evidence, because it does not exclude competing claims. That resurrection video I saw the other day, do you think it was a resurrection?
No, I saw that video. The guy's literally breathing and moving inside the coffin. It was clearly false.
The video started after the resurrection process had started. So the video started when he recovered his breath. How do you discount that?
It's a nice ad hoc statement, but it's clearly ad hoc, yeah.
It's clearly ad hoc. That reminds me of how a lot of apologists harmonize frictions within the Gospels. Completely ad hoc, right?
Yeah. So the point I wanted to make about this section is, remember what we're trying to account for is why it is that there are claims made about Jesus, and whether or not it's because Jesus actually did rise from the dead, or whether or not it's some other type of explanation, like a literary explanation or a legend explanation or a hallucination, or like the disjunction of all of them. Now, in this case of this video of a person being apparently resurrected, people come to believe that he's resurrected. So, for example, there's the people in the video itself who come to believe that he was resurrected, but there are also people all around the internet who have subsequently come to believe that there was this resurrection that took place. Now, Mike notices that we have the ability to scrutinize this particular resurrection case because we have video of it, and he makes some observation about how the person was breathing before they were resurrected.
Excellent point, Cam.
The difficulty is that we don't have the ability to do that with respect to the resurrection of Jesus. We have a static, unchanging list of data that we're working from. We don't have any access to the past other than that. And so just in the same way as I think it would be fallacious to be convinced by the fact that there were other people who were convinced by this video. I think it's fallacious to be convinced by the fact that there were people who were convinced that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. And
Yeah, I think a good analogy would be like Mike believing in the resurrection of Jesus based on the texts of the New Testament is equivalent to someone on the internet believing in the resurrection of that guy in the video, not even based on watching the video, but being based on reading a text about what's going on in the video, written by someone who had previously also became convinced that the guy on the video was raised from the dead, right?
And have a think about it. Like, would the person who had become convinced tell you in the text about all of the, things that were anomalies, like, the things that they couldn't explain? Well, they probably didn't even consider those things because apparently they weren't very critical or they weren't very skeptical. And we're supposing that the investigations, the people who came to believe that Jesus was resurrected, that they actually had reasonable epistemologies. But for all evidence we can see, they probably didn't. They, belonged to groups of people who placed high importance on visionary experiences and spiritual experiences that we now understand contextualized within the philosophy of religion and the sociology of religion as being commonplace occurrences across the world that don't point to divine, figures. Anyway.
By the way, if anybody watches the original video, I was pretty active in the chat there. I was John Wick in the chat. Just I had about 10 or 12 Christians talking to me at one time. It's pretty funny. I'm watching it back here.
I agree, and yet you accept something with less supporting evidence. That is my point. And yet you accuse me of evidence not mattering when the evidence is the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter how many people believed it, how sincerely they believed it, what religious context something was put into, or the fact that we couldn't come up with a better explanation. What matters is the evidence. And the fact that I cannot tell you what evidence would establish a resurrection is not a problem for my epistemology. It is a problem for the resurrection claim. There are countless things that I believe, and I believe them based on evidence. And for somebody to accuse me of not caring about evidence, when it's clear that I do believe things and I believe them based on evidence, and I'm willing to accept things, including your attestation for the spear being a common part or a standard part of crucifixion process, I'm willing to take you at your word for that. Because the claim is not extraordinary. It is extraordinary claims that require extraordinary evidence. And the notion that this person was raised from the dead is absolutely extraordinary. And there is no physical evidence for it. There is no contemporary evidence for it. There's no evidence that this is even possible. And yet you just want to dismiss it as if Matt won't accept evidence. No, Matt won't accept insufficient evidence, and neither should other people.
Okay, well, I have a couple things I'd like to share about that. You mentioned a quote I've heard many times. I've heard especially in the skeptics community, which is the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I think, and I want to...
Like, I've heard this before, but without even hearing this, I know exactly where he's going. I've heard it 1,000 times.
For your opinion on this, but I think that this is circular. Let me explain why I think it's circular, and you tell me where you think I'm wrong here. If I have an extraordinary claim, like Jesus is risen from the dead, and you require that I have extraordinary evidence to prove it, whatever evidence I offer that's extraordinary will in itself be a claim that's extraordinary, to which you can respond, I won't believe that until you have more extraordinary evidence. Well, if I do bring that, well, that's also extraordinary, which you don't believe unless you have extraordinary evidence. And this just circularly goes on forever, ruling out ordinary evidence.
So this goes back to something that I've actually engaged directly with Mike on, and it frustrates me that he didn't bother to learn from me. That's getting personal, but it does actually annoy me. He seems to not understand what is meant by extraordinary. He thinks that it pertains to the sort of the character of it. Like, for example, the content must be,
I can tell you why, Cam.
Yeah, I don't mischaracterize him, but like he seems to think that it relates to the content of it that's extraordinary. But it's not about that. What extraordinary means in this sort of, phrase, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which I actually do have some criticism of. But what it means to be extraordinary is that it has a degree of unexpectedness when you compare the different explanations of the data in question. And the degree of unexpectedness rises to the same level of the unexpectedness of the claim. And you can get this through ordinary evidence, for example, visual evidence and looking at things and just mundane things, or recording things on a video camera or whatever. There are or, for example, extraordinary claims like the claims of quantum mechanics have been thoroughly demonstrated through exactly this type of extraordinary form of evidence gathering process. For example, beginning with things like the double slit experiment, etc. So he just doesn't understand what is even meant by this phrase, and so his critique always falls short because he doesn't.
Cam, I have a guess where this came from. I actually think that in the dark, dirty basements of apologetics, they get together and they figure, okay, how are we going to combat this pithy phrase? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I think they think, well, this is the answer we give, that any evidence you can present is mundane, right? And so you're exactly right. The extraordinary evidence is what it means. I'm going to be very pedantic here, very simple. It means that it's a bunch of mundane claims that help rise the evidence that the claim is actually true.
I think my thinking is that Mike is equivocating between extraordinary and supernatural. Because his concern is that we are just like so stuck in our existing worldviews that like no amount of evidence is going to convince us that something supernatural has actually happened. But it's very important to realize that the distinction isn't between the supernatural and the natural. It's the distinction between what we see going on around us and what we don't, right? Like we have accepted a lot of like insane claims because they have met the burden of evidence. Like the Earth being a sphere, for example, that's like extremely extraordinary, especially if when it was first presented, given what people like saw around them, right?
Absolutely.
And that was motivated by enough evidence, which itself is like mundane, like a guy measuring a difference in an angle of a shadow or length of a shadow in two different places and stuff like that. So
and it seems like that claim isn't extraordinary anymore because we have a different context of background knowledge. But when that claim was initially made, it was like, nobody thought that was true. And I think that there are many examples of these types of extraordinary claims for which we have got extraordinary evidence, but it does so happen that none of them do fall into the supernatural category. But that's not our fault. That's just sort of what's happened when we've discovered more about the world. And I don't reject the supernatural out of hand at all. And in fact, I actually disagree with certain characterizations of methodological naturalism, because I think that we should actually consider explanations that appeal to the supernatural, and we should have an epistemology that deals with them and deals with them on their merits and their bad qualities.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point to make. Like, I also don't rule out the supernatural by hypothesis. I wouldn't say that I'm like a methodological naturalist. Like every time Bart Ehrman, for example, says that a historian can never conclude that something supernatural happened because those kind of things are like outside the realm of history. I want to like roll up my newspapers and like slap him to like bad historian.
Yeah, but the reason why supernatural explanations aren't typically appealed to in history is because they're not very good explanations, because they fail for a variety of different reasons.
Yeah, they don't fail a priori, just by the virtue of them being supernatural. They usually fail because of explanatory virtues and vices. Yeah.
What would be an example of an extraordinary evidence for a resurrection, in your guys' opinion? Keep it really pithy.
A first century account of Jesus appearing to people in Mesoamerica, where we can actually verify it's authentic. You can still say time travel aliens, but my confidence in the resurrection actually taking place.
I like that one.
Me too.
I usually, when people ask me what would cause me to become a Christian, I usually mention a miracle of my sister, but I'm starting to use that one, Kamil, that you Totally a long
And you
time
know what's
ago.
better? Because that's actually mundane. Like we have writings from first century Mesoamerica, so and it wouldn't even be difficult for Jesus to do, you know.
Okay, but let's put it today. I think this is important to talk about. What would be the extraordinary evidence that you personally would require for a resurrection today?
I think it's a lot of the things that we've talked about. For the resurrection of Jesus, or for
No.
just a resurrection?
Just anybody today.
For me, I would want documented, or just given the fact that I'm aware that there are a lot of resurrection claims today that, when you investigate them, don't turn out to be very good. The type of evidence that I would want is actually verifiable evidence that the person was really dead for a considerable period of time. That means that, on the basis of our understanding and background knowledge of physics, the brain would have deteriorated such to a state that it would require a miracle for them to come back to be revived. So we do obviously have cases of people being dead for like short amounts of time and then coming back alive again, but that's because of the reason why that's possible is because of the fact that the brain by that stage hasn't deteriorated to the point of significant brain damage. So I would want to see verifiable
Yeah. So let me.
yeah.
This is. I think you and I are on the same page. I'm going to summarize it. Okay, for Christians listening who just think this extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, this is extraordinary, but it's all mundane at the same time. Extraordinary because when you put them all together, it's amazing. Number one, you take a DNA test of the person alive. You got their DNA signature. You can take it 5 times for people of 5 different biases if you want. Then that person dies. The decomposition process has begun. You have heart rate monitors. What?
Destroy the body, like vaporize the body.
Oh yeah,
completely.
vaporize. Yeah, put a nuclear bomb in the body. Put a nuclear bomb in the body and blow it up. A small nuke. Okay. And you can have 5 different.
I mean, we don't need that, but
yeah, we don't need that, but that does it.
Necessary precondition, but
you don't even need the echograms or card. Yeah, that's overkill. But and then you can have that televised by 5 different independent radio stations and TV stations around the world. Okay, and then the miracle happens, right? This person comes back to life. Then you take a blood sample and take the DNA again. I have just given you extraordinary evidence for an extraordinary claim that someone rose from the dead. You can have heart rate monitors to show the person's really alive. You can ask them questions that the person who died would only know, and so forth. And here's the kicker: if you could repeat that like 30 more times, wow, we're done. Resurrection is now in the science books. It's confirmed.
Yeah, I would say more like in general, just the same quality and quantity of evidence that is available for a number of like very counterintuitive claims in physics, like a Schrodinger's cat, Winger's friends. Not talking about Mike Winger, but wave particle duality, time dilation, length contraction. Like that's all insane shit, like delayed choice quantum eraser experiments where it looks like the arrow of time is reversed, stuff like that. That's like very extraordinary, but it's not very difficult to prove. So if we were able to take the same processes, the same people, the same methods and stuff like that, and apply it to resurrection, that would be completely satisfactory.
Yeah,
and that would
I'm going to say if that evidence that I just described is 100 on the scale of evidence, what we have for Jesus is like a 2, maybe even a 1.
I think it's like a 1. I would love to continue here because Mike is going to bring up the lottery example, and I would love to engage with that.
Okay.
For hypothetical extraordinary evidence that can never pass, never even enter the conversation.
No, the statement is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. When you say, if I present extraordinary evidence, that's now extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. No, That is not an extraordinary claim. It is evidence that would satisfy the extraordinary. A better way of phrasing it might be that in order for the belief to be warranted, evidence must be sufficient or rise to the level of the extraordinariness of the claim. If I say, hey, I just bought a winning lottery ticket, that's an extraordinary claim. When I have the money, that is the extraordinary evidence that the claim was true.
I think an even better piece of evidence would just be, I watch the lottery numbers or I look them up online, and then you show me your ticket and it has the right numbers on it. And that's really ordinary evidence.
Except it's not, because I can print a winning lottery ticket. I'm a magician. Magicians do this trick on stage all the time. The extraordinary evidence is actually getting paid by the Lottery Commission, not just, look, I have some.
Yeah, so I wanted to criticize Matt on this because I think that he too easily switched to the consideration of what it would be like for an external observer to verify that you had got a winning lottery ticket. But for example, if I play the lottery and I get a ticket and I'm looking at my own ticket and I know that I haven't made this ticket up, like I know that I went and bought it from the shop and that I got the numbers that I did, and then I put it in my wallet and I held it in my wallet, and then I'm looking at the ticket and I see the numbers coming up. That evidence actually alone of reading the numbers off the ticket multiple times and looking them in relation to what's coming up on the TV or what's coming up on the lottery website, that actually does constitute evidence sufficient to establish the claim that you have a winning lottery ticket. So I think that Matt too easily went outside of the case of you verifying your own lottery ticket to the case of you verifying that somebody else has won the lottery. And I do understand his skepticism there, because yes, you can produce fraudulent lottery tickets, but when you know yourself that you didn't do that, just simply reading the numbers off the ticket, which is mundane. It's mundane as anything, like just looking at a chair, pretty much. I mean, you might want to do it a couple of times to make sure that your bias towards you winning the lottery didn't make you read the numbers incorrectly. But that is sufficient evidence. You don't need to go and get the actual money to know that you have a winning lottery ticket.
Yeah, but the only reason why Mike brought this up is to show that this is mundane evidence, right? And so, Mike, you need to tell all your apologist friends that we're not saying that the evidence has to be extraordinary or a miracle. That no, the evidence is mundane. It's just, it would be unexpected evidence. It would be sufficient evidence. Yeah. It'd be a whole bunch of pile of evidence, like DNA evidence is pretty good evidence.
Here's what I want to try to explain to Mike if he ever watches this, which he probably won't, but is that it is extraordinarily unexpected that you would read the ticket multiple times and observe the numbers on the hypothesis that it is not the winning lottery ticket versus that it is the winning lottery ticket. That's the whole point, is that you can very easily get extraordinary evidence for something, because extraordinary just means that one hypothesis predicts the data that you're observing to a degree that the other hypothesis doesn't, and that those differences are so large to be sufficient to overcome the prior probability. That can happen easily for a lottery, and it happens all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say,
go ahead.
I've been watching Matt Dillahunty for a number of years, and I have to say I like him less and less. And it's just because as he gets older, he looks more and more like James White.
That's why you like him less and less, just because of his looks. I commend Matt Dillahunty on his looks. He's lost. I sometimes watch old videos, debates from 10 years ago, 7 years ago. Matt, how much weight have you lost? It's like...
I think it might, in this case, it might be because of diabetes.
He has diabetes? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think it might be quite severe. Because I don't want to talk about it really, but sometimes you can tell that you lose weight, but it doesn't look healthy.
Oh, no. So, no. I mean, I think I have some evidence against that. So Matt has
Okay.
actually been working really hard on his health, and he's been like exercising and losing weight through exercise.
Cool. That's just because he said so, right? That's probably one of the examples where the claim is sufficient to warrant belief.
Okay, let's play one, maybe 2 more minutes, and then we're done.
Something that matches those numbers. This is the failure of skepticism that you are engaging in this process.
Okay, I would add, that's great to see you actually get paid the money. That's also really good. But this is kind of ordinary events. One person giving another person money, unless the quantity of money is considered extraordinary. In which case, I would say the number of appearances of Jesus are extraordinary.
Reports of appearances of Jesus are not appearances of Jesus. When I say I have a winning lottery ticket, that's an extraordinary claim, because while it happens fairly regularly, it's still extraordinary. It's more extraordinary than saying I have a losing lottery ticket. And if I just show you the ticket, that's not extraordinary evidence. Extraordinary evidence is when I confirm that this is in fact a winning lottery ticket and I get paid, because that is an event that is more extraordinary than having a losing lottery ticket. All that claim is saying is that the quantity and quality of evidence for a claim is dependent on how extraordinary that claim is. If you say, I just got a pet puppy, I need nothing more than your word, because as I pointed out, I already know there are puppies. I know people have puppies as pets. There's nothing extraordinary about this. You could be lying, but the only risk to me in believing you and taking you at your word is that I ultimately find out you're a liar. Now, I may have reasons to not want to find out that you're a liar. Like I don't want to find out my mom's lying about the demon thing. I'd prefer to think that she's just, either not able to present her evidence or that she was confused or whatever. But if somebody says Jesus rose from the dead, that's an extraordinary claim that has fundamental impact on everything else in my life. And that's why I say that the evidence for that needs to be not only sufficient to that claim, but needs to overcome all the evidence for all the beliefs that contradict that.
So
So I thought that was a pretty good summary by Matt. Christians, I think you can intuitively understand what Matt's saying when you think about the evidence that you would require for you to leave Christianity and embrace a different religion. Like, what if Islam is actually true, or Judaism? What kind of evidence would you need to see to drop Christianity and take one of those religions? My guess is you would need quite a bit, right? And these are all mundane evidences, but you would need probably evidence to show that yours is false and shows that theirs is true. And it would have to be a lot and unexpected, and it would have to pile up, and it would probably take years and years and years for you to see it, to understand it, to accept it. And this is actually the process of many atheists who are former believers. This is what has happened to them. Any final thoughts, guys? Who won this debate?
Matt. Well, I have to say, just in terms of performance, the opening argument by Matt, I think, was really disorganized and kind of all over the place. Like, if I didn't know that much about it, I wouldn't. That wouldn't leave very lasting impressions. But there were some interesting points. Like, one which we didn't get to talk about was about the Damascus Road experience, where Mike accused Matt of reading into the text, like seconds after he said something. I think the appearance was physical because it caused Paul to drop down, fall down, right? So Jesus probably sucker punched him or something like that. That's how we know it was physical Jesus and not spiritual Jesus, because if it was spiritual Jesus, the fist would go through the body of Paul. Keep standing, right? So that's reading into the text.
Yeah, I mean, that's not what he said, not what his explanation was, but yes, he's reading into the text by assuming that him falling over was evidence of it being a physical Jesus.
Hey guys, I'm gonna use the restroom, but I just typed in the chat that tag me for questions. Cam, you can see the questions, right? Or the chat. So you guys can just talk and answer questions from the audience. Here's your chance, guys. You got two really smart guys here, very knowledgeable. Ask it whatever you want. I'll be back in a bit.
So, McGorg Go. What's your name? I don't know. He says, PineCreek, would you ever consider a structured debate, or will you be sticking with conversations? I can't really answer for him, but I know that Doug has been getting a bit tired of conversations with apologists and with Christians, and has been producing different content. And I also don't think that he particularly likes structured debate. But if it was structured debate that had back and forth stuff, I think he'd probably be more likely to accept. But no, I have no idea whether or not he would. Abductions says, PineCreek, don't you think that Matt seems to grant the reliability of Acts, since Paul doesn't corroborate details of his own conversion? Do you have something on that?
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting point that I think atheists or non-Christians do. They do that quite often. They, first of all, grant the reliability of Acts. I don't. And before I mentioned that, just because if you think that the evangelists wrote the story in order to make it look like it fulfills the prophecy, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were being dishonest. I think the author of Luke Acts was deliberately being dishonest. Like, that's the instance where he knew that he's like making stuff up, and he does that on purpose. And that there is a lot of great scholarship about that. Richard Pervo and some other things, some other guys really made a very compelling case for that, which is a shame because if Acts is not reliable, then we don't really know how Christianity started, which that sucks, right? Like, I would love just be able to say that it's reliable, but unfortunately it's not. But the point is that, yeah, I don't think that in the Pauline letters, definitely not in the authentic Pauline letters, the actual Damascus Road experience is ever told, right? Like, the only source we have is Acts. Is that right? I think so, right?
Well, he does say in Galatians 1, I think, he says that effectively, like, what I'm relaying to, the gospel that I'm relaying to you is not something that I learned through by a man, but I learned it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. He does say that, which seems to be talking about his the way in which he received his information, but that doesn't necessarily map onto the Damascus Road thing. I mean, the other one, of course, is where he says, like, I know a person in Christ who some years ago, whether in the body or out of the body, had an experience where he was taken up to the third heaven, which scholars do take to be him talking about himself. But then again, I don't know whether or not that's meant to be the Damascus. Yeah, so yes, you were right. He never mentions the Damascus Road.
So there are three heavens.
Yeah.
It's like more up than the first or second.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, it's like a third floor. But nowhere in the letters does he, like, Paul himself says, like, for example, I heard a voice, I saw the light, I fall down, I went blind. The other people who were around with me heard the voice. Like, none of that is in the letters. That's only in Acts, right?
That's right.
So yeah, I think Matt probably didn't realize that. I would definitely point that out.
Gerard said, once we entertain the possibility of demons, angels, supernatural powers, forces, doesn't the number of possible explanations increase exponentially? I think that was basically his question. I would say yes. And this is one of the tactics, what's his name, Arif Ahmed used against, I think, Gary Habermas in his debate. Like, if there's really a supernatural force out there, if demons are real, if Satan's real, how do we know that that these authors of the New Testament were possessed, and that maybe Jesus was risen by the power of Satan? And for some stupid reason, Satan wanted people to think God did it, because maybe in the future he has some plan. We don't know the mind of Satan, but maybe he has sufficient reasons for for the evil that he does.
So Roger Wade says, is hearsay a problem when it comes to the Gospels when considering it as a historical document?
Does it mean that the Gospels are not written by eyewitnesses? Is that the question? Probably yes, right?
Yeah, like I think he's saying if the Gospels are hearsay, does that mean it's a problem to consider them historical?
Yeah, not necessarily. I think like it wouldn't hurt if the Gospel of Matthew started by, I, Matthew, the tax collector from Galilee, saw this and that, and then it would be his original composition and not a copy of Mark, who supposedly wasn't an eyewitness. But I think it's not necessarily about the fact that the authors were not there, like on the ground, because we have a lot of ancient accounts by people who lived like long time after the events that they are describing. I think when we talk about like ancient narratives, we are looking for other markers of general reliability, like identification of sources, discussion of their general reliability, pointing out like multiple different versions of the same account, discussing the relative merits of the sources and stuff like that. Then it trumps the fact that the story is hearsay. Like the Life of Alexander by Plutarch is written 400 years after the fact, but Plutarch specifically names like 25 different sources, including historians who were actually paid by Alexander to accompany him during the campaign and write down his history almost like on the same day. So it's not necessarily a problem. There are much more problems with the Gospels than that, obviously.
This is a challenge I would give to Christians, and they hate it. They hate it. They hate it. And it is name one person who writes with their own hand in the first person that they saw the risen Jesus in bodily form, or just any form, I guess. And the answer is only Paul. And, they so much want to throw in attestations in there that John wrote John and so forth. And he said it, but nowhere. Here's a challenge for you Christians. Go in the book of John. And I hope you can have a software, you know where to look so you can get the whole text. Do a Control F on the word John. And you'll see that in every instance that the book of Gospel of John uses the word John, it's to describe John the Baptist, not John. So therefore my criteria is moot. It's gone. John does not say, "Hi, I'm John, and I saw the risen Jesus." It's always the disciple that Jesus loved, who some Christians think is even Lazarus. So why bother? Blue-collar heathen asks, why bother debating the resurrection in the first place? It does not and cannot prove Christianity is true. Well, you still need the resurrection, according to Paul, if that didn't happen, then one can say Christianity is false, right? Blue-collar heathen. But I understand what you're saying, and I agree. The devil could have rose Jesus from the dead, and Christianity false. DB Cisco asks, upon what besides the alleged consensus does one accept a first century Paul? Good question. What do we know about this Paul guy in history? Do you want to take that, Kamil?
Yeah, that's...
one possible way of thinking that, which is it's going to be dependent on your perspective of Marcion, but for example, if you think that Marcion is collecting together letters that was actually circulating about Paul, and that Marcion is collecting those in the early 2nd century, which is what it seems to be the case, then assumedly those letters were circulating prior to the early 2nd century in order for them to be collected. So, but that's going to depend on what your position on the origin of the letters that Marcion collects are. But to my knowledge, like the first or like the best sort of references to the Pauline epistles outside of the New Testament epistles themselves is related to Marcion. Kamil, you might...
Yeah, just really quickly. I think in history, in the discipline of history, the null hypothesis where it comes to authorial attribution. So you have a text coming from antiquity, and then you have authorial attribution attached to it. Either the author identifies himself in the text, or it's on the manuscript, like written on the title, or someone else says that this text was produced by that author. I think the null hypothesis is to assume that it's true, unless you have strong reasons to doubt it, or that there could be reasons that actually reverse the conclusion, right? So, for example, there are about 60 works in the Hippocratic corpus, and I think the consensus is that none of them can actually be tied back to historical Hippocrates. Some scholars argue like a core of 13 that could be attributed to him. So it's actually possible to start with a bunch of works that have authorial attribution and then conclude that the attribution is false. But I think in case of Paul, with the 6 or 7 authentic letters, we don't have sufficiently strong reasons to do that. So I would just by default say, they say they were written by a guy named Paul, so I'm going to assume that there was a guy named Paul who wrote them, but I wouldn't presume to say that he was from Tarsus. I think he wasn't born in Tarsus. Doesn't mean that obviously you have to accept like everything else that anyone else says about Paul.
Let's move on. Darkin asks, is there an argument you would have brought up that Matt didn't against the reasonableness of believing the resurrection? Darkin, that's a great question. I would have used the outsider test of faith more, talk about all the miracle claims that Mike does not believe. But Mike admitted something. He admitted that the entombed Jesus and that the tomb was empty as the least attested to fact of those 12 facts he listed. I would have pounced on that and said, but what criteria do you use? Why do you think they don't believe that more than Jesus died, for example? Get into the specifics on what criteria Mike uses.
Yeah, I would definitely make efforts to present a case for literary mythography in the New Testament, in particular, in connection in stories specifically connected to the passion and resurrection narratives. I would definitely make more of a case of the synoptic problem and how evidence being relied on by Mark is quite clearly expansion on an earlier gospel. I would make more arguments that draw the contradictions and differences between our earliest accounts of visions of Jesus in Paul, potentially visions of Jesus and Paul, and the gospel narratives. And there's a variety of different points that I would want to establish against Mike.
Yeah, very quickly, I would justify or motivate my low prior probability of the resurrection by appealing to natural revelation and natural theology.
Me too.
Because that's just...
Yeah, so I think, I would start with my broad argument would be something like the following. Premise one is that on the assumption that natural theology is true, God extraordinarily and frequently has the desire to raise people from the dead. And then I'd establish that the contents of the New Testament do not rise to the degree sufficient to overcome that prior improbability.
Trevor Lynn, yes, you can call us Doug's Dogma, and you're welcome. That I don't know about me, but that Kamil and Cam can teach you more about scholarship than any theologian. Let's see here. Sanjeev, yes, it could have been Satan's plan to make Jews into idolaters, and that's why Satan would raise Jesus from the dead. Good point. P or not P, PineCreek, if Christianity can't be justified by resurrection alone, what other propositions beside the physical resurrection of Jesus would need to be true in order for Christianity to be true? That's a tough question, because you got to first define what Christianity actually is. Until you know what it actually is, it's pretty hard to demonstrate it.
Yeah, like for example, let's say that Christianity is true, but the Messiah has not been born yet. Like, would in that case, would it still, like, there is a Trinity, like Jesus is still is real, but he's just waiting in the lobby to actually be incarnated and like die for our sins, right? Like, would that make Christianity still true? I think technically yes, right?
Like, if a lot of Christians say if Christianity is true if the resurrection of Jesus happened, but they don't go in the details. Does it have to be true that the Trinity is true?
Yeah, that's the thing. Is that if Christianity is just the resurrection of Jesus, then establishing the resurrection of Jesus would establish Christianity. But there are lots of other claims in Christianity that people who call themselves Christians adhere to, and it obviously wouldn't establish those things.
Yeah, and also mythicism can be true and Christianity can be true at the same time, right? Because the mythicists argue that the first Christians actually believed that resurrection, crucifixion, the execution and the resurrection of Jesus took place. It just didn't take place on earth. And that can be true. Like, it could be true that Jesus actually took human form and he was killed. It just wasn't an earthly event. So in that case, the resurrection is technically false, but Christianity is still true.
Paul James, what about the account in Matthew 28, the suggestion that disciples stole the body, and that this was the common knowledge among the Jews at the time? Not exactly sure what he's asking. Is this evidence that?
This basically the reasoning goes that unless the account would not be in Matthew unless there were people proposing that as an alternative explanation. And the fact that there were people proposing that as an alternative explanation shows that the body was actually empty, because otherwise they would just say the body is still in the tomb, right? So you have like two-step process. The problem is that there are issues with both steps, right? Like, it could be the case that the author is just expecting that counter-apologetic, so is actively trying to counter it, like preemptively. And also it could be the case that the critics of the resurrection were just being backed skeptics. Like, they took the claim of the empty tomb at face value, and they were trying to come up with an explanation rather than asking the important question, how do we know there was even an empty tomb in the first place?
Well, yeah, and it's only mentioned once in the book of Matthew, and 40 years later, 50 years later, like, I think it's just to make the story more interesting.
Well, I mean, it has to be pointed out that within Matthew, it exists within a story we already understand to be redacting Mark and elaborating on it with fanciful additions. So it's, yeah. I mean, it's already occurring in something that historians don't think is reliable.
Okay, guys, I think we need to shut this down before it hits 3 hours, or did it already? Oh, we're getting close. But it was fun. So my goal was to do it under 2 hours. And
Yeah, I think it was fun, but I think the next time me and Cam shouldn't be probably on at the same time.
we shouldn't what at the same time?
Me and Cam be on the same time.
Yeah.
But actually, the last time I was on, we also went for like 3 hours, close to 3 hours, I think. So maybe I'm the problem.
I'm the problem too.
My apologies to Mike Winger. He actually was scheduled to come on today and defend himself, but we ran out of time. Sorry, Mike. Maybe next time.
Yeah. Lots of people love you.
I can't hear you, Cam. Did you say people love me? Yeah, I agree with that.
You have meaning and purpose, Doug.
Oh, yes. Mike gives me meaning and purpose. Thanks for joining in on the live chat, everyone. Thanks for the donations if I missed any. Have a great Sunday.